Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Congress has a constitutional duty to provide for our national defense and a sacred obligation to support those who put on the uniform to protect us. Today, the Rules Committee will consider legislation that will continue to allow Congress to deliver on these dual commitments. H.R. 8580, the Military Constructions, Veterans Affairs, and Related Agencies Appropriations Act for fiscal year 2025, will fulfill our Article 1 responsibilities, support military families, and honor the service of our veterans. Importantly, the bill achieves the mission while supporting the fiscal responsibility, staying true to our shared values, and guarding against executive branch overreach. Since January of 2021, the world has grown more dangerous. House Republicans recognize this reality. That's why the Department of Defense's military construction and family housing funding within the bill comes in at over $400 million more than President Biden's initial budget request. We could not maintain any semblance of national security without the sacrifices of our service members and their families. The bill before us today represents an important step forward for their quality of life. H.R. 8580 sets aside over $1 billion for 11 barracks projects, including $75 million above fiscal year 2025 budget requests for the design of future barracks to address deficiencies that were identified by the GAO. It also provides $2 billion for military family housing, including $75 million above the enacted level for child development centers. Additionally, H.R. 8580 provides over $1 billion for investments in the Indo-Pacific region, including $700 million for investments in Guam to defend the United States and our partners and allies in the region. It also allocates $943 million for Guard and Reserve, delivering $40 million above the fiscal year 25 budget request and bolstering our force readiness. This appropriations bill also honors the American heroes who've answered the call to serve. Overall funding for the Department of Veterans Affairs comes in at over $75 million over President Biden's number. This legislation fully funds the veterans' health care programs, veterans' benefits, and VA programs, ensuring those who defended our freedom to get the care and support they have earned. It also allocates $105 million for maintenance and construction at Arlington National Cemetery, guaranteeing our heroes can continue to be laid to rest there for years to come. H.R. 8580 does all this while staying true to our shared values and curbing the worst impulses of a woke administration. It prohibits taxpayer dollars from being used for abortion while including exceptions for rape, incest, and the life of the mother, consistent with the Hyde Amendment language. This legislation also safeguards veterans' Second Amendment rights by preventing the VA from sending information about them to the FBI. Finally, it prevents the VA from processing medical care for claims for illegal aliens. The White House has allowed their woke agenda to define every aspect of their administration, even their obligation to defend our nation. H.R. 8580 refocuses the Department of Defense on its core mission. It prohibits the use of funds to advance critical race theory and prevents the implementation, the administration, or the enforcement of the Biden administration's DEI initiatives. It also reaffirms political limits of the Hatch Act, particularly those of lobbying Congress and using official resources for political purposes. Under House Democrats, more than $3 trillion was spent outside the annual appropriations process, birthing an inflation crisis that continues to rob Americans of their hard-earned money. House Republicans have made a commitment to reverse this course. I'm proud this committee is advancing legislation that honors that commitment while supporting our heroes and refocusing the federal government on its core responsibilities. Additionally, the committee will consider H.R. 8282, the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act. America and our allies are committed to the pursuit of justice home and abroad. That's why we cannot stand idly by and accept the baseless harassment of Israel at the hands of the International Criminal Court. Their unilateral decision to investigate the Jewish state and issue arrest warrants for Israeli officials is unacceptable. The ICC must face consequences for overriding the sovereignty and the judicial system of our ally. H.R. 8282 requires the President to impose sanctions on the ICC and condemns their dangerous decision to treat a democratic ally the same as a terrorist regime. As Israel continues to face multiple threats to their continued existence, it is essential Congress do everything we can to stand with the Jewish state. Finally, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge my staff director, Kelly Dixon Chambers, who will be retiring after nearly 26 years of dedicated service to the House of Representatives. Kelly began her congressional service as a staff assistant in the California delegation. She rose to lead the oldest committee in the House of Representatives. She played no small part in making the rules for the people who make the rules in Washington. To say this is a tremendous loss for the Rules Committee and to this institution would be an understatement. On behalf of all House Republicans, I can say that Kelly will be sorely missed. For Rules Committee members, I can say that we will miss her impassioned timekeeping and her attention to detail on the smallest of matters. I would now like to yield to my colleague, Mr. McGovern of Massachusetts, for any comments he wishes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I begin, I wanted to echo your remarks about Kelly and also add some of my own. There's no doubt that Kelly is an exceptional public servant. She is a master legislative strategist. She knows everything about rules and procedures. She spent her time here on Capitol Hill working to improve this institution and uphold the traditions of this committee. And she's also done a lot to foster an environment of mutual respect and camaraderie behind the scenes, which we all benefit from and we all appreciate. In short, she's one of the most effective people I have ever worked with on Capitol Hill. And all I have to say is that I love and respect her a whole lot, and I will genuinely miss her. And I've said this to her before, my only problem with Kelly is that she isn't a Democrat. I don't know, but I don't hold that against her. And in fact, she's made me sharper and better at my job because I know she always brings her A game to everything she does. And I know I speak for the Democratic staff on the Rules Committee when I say that we're all going to miss her. And it's just been an incredible honor and pleasure to work with her. So thank you, Kelly, for all that you have done for Congress and for this country and for the world. And for the people here who call you a friend and mentor, and I include myself in that list, we wish you all the very best as you step into this new chapter of your life and career. Thank you. And now, to get to business, we have two bills that we will consider today. First is House Republicans' fiscal year 2025 proposal for military construction appropriations. MilCon should be one of the least controversial funding bills Congress passes each year. And let me set the record straight. This is not a typical MilCon bill. Once again, House Republicans are loading it up like a MAGA Christmas tree, full of shiny culture war nonsense, the same attacks on abortion access, attacks on the LGBTQ plus community, attacks on diversity and inclusion efforts, just more narrow-minded, hateful MAGA riders that inject partisan politics into what should be a bipartisan bill. And Mr. Chairman, you referred to all of this as combating Democratic wokeness. I got to tell you, if my daughter were here right now, she wouldn't consider protecting women's reproductive rights woke. She'd be wondering why you're trying to take away rights that her mother had that she no longer has. So this isn't about wokeness. This is about doing what is right. The bill also holds the VA back from protecting struggling vets who may pose a danger to themselves or others, preventing the agency from adding vulnerable vets to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. And this bill zeroes out funding for climate change and resilience projects, something that will jeopardize our national security because it means our military installations will not be prepared for the realities of climate change. At the end of the day, this funding bill is full of poison pills and harmful policy riders that endanger our national security and hurts the quality of life for veterans, those who serve, and their families. Second on our agenda is H.R. 8282, a bill to impose sanctions on the International Criminal Court. Now, let me just speak for myself here. I think this is a bad bill. The International Criminal Court is an important institution, and those who care about human rights would certainly agree with that assessment. And I think that it is not in America's moral or strategic interest to attack the court for attempting to do its job. This bill makes a mockery of the rules-based international order that America helped build. It would totally undermine everything we have said and done to pursue accountability for Russian aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Ukraine. Should this bill pass, it would completely isolate us internationally, including and especially from our closest allies, and it would deepen accusations of hypocrisy that have already caused a mind-boggling level of damage to the reputation of the United States and our soft power capabilities. You know, people don't have to like every action by the ICC, but I would point out to my colleagues that this is the beginning of a process. And with all due respect, at the end of the day, this isn't about a particular government or a particular illegal armed group. This is about the victims. This is about the victims, and it is about preventing even more victims. And for all that is being said on this topic, I rarely hear my colleagues on the other side talk about the victims in Israel, who were viciously attacked on October 7th, and the Palestinian victims who continue to be bombed and who continue to be denied basic essentials like food and medicine. So, I look forward to a robust debate, and I thank all of our witnesses for being here, and I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses may have will be included in the record. I would like to welcome to the witness table our first panel, Chairman John Carter and Ranking Member Debbie Wasserman Schultz from the Committee on Appropriations. And Chairman Carter, we welcome your testimony.
Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member Govern, and the members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the FY25 Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Appropriations Bill. This special bill supports our troops, their families, and the nation's veterans. The bill makes good on Republican commitments to bring bills to the floor that comply with the Fiscal Responsibility Act while honoring our commitment to our nation's veterans and our troops. To honor that commitment, the bill provides full funding for health care and benefits for veterans. They have earned these benefits, and we are making good on our promise to them. To provide for those that wear the uniform now, the bill includes $412 million over the budget request to support crucial investments for barracks, family housing, and we keep our word to provide for our service members and their families. In addition, we provide robust funding to build upon last year's work to enable the Department of Defense to meet the challenges in the Indo-Pacific. We also have multiple provisions in our bill to protect Americans' core values, namely freedom, equality, and justice, from being trampled by unaccountable bureaucrats. I'd like to thank Ranking Member Wasserman Schultz. Though we have our policy differences, I'm glad we are at this step in our process and hope we can continue to work together to support our troops and veterans. This bill cares for our veterans, supports our troops and their families, and stands up for American values. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I'm ready to answer your questions. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Ranking Member Wasserman Schultz, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member McGovern, thank you for having me here to discuss my concerns as Ranking Member of the Milcon VA Subcommittee with the fiscal year 2025 Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill, H.R. 8580. Traditionally, the Milcon VA bill is one of the few appropriations bills that has bipartisan support because the bill is generally written with an eye towards our shared goal of supporting our service members, veterans, and their families, no matter who is in the majority. And I have appreciated for many years working with my colleague and friend, Judge Carter. I completely agree with him. We do have policy differences from time to time, but generally we take the same approach to, and each of our bills, when we've chaired this committee, looks similarly. Unfortunately, we have some addendums this year that have blown that apart. Unfortunately, though, again this year, we're seeing that traditional bipartisanship crumble because sadly the Republican majority veered drastically from what is normally that shared goal. Last year, we started the appropriations process with threats of 22% cuts across all departments and agencies. We came to a bipartisan agreement in the middle of the appropriations process with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. While not perfect by any means, it was necessary to get our jobs done and provide for the American people. Even then, chaos ensued with bills funded at levels lower than the agreement and riddled with partisan riders. It wasn't until March, 6 months into the fiscal year, that we finally met the Fiscal Responsibility Act agreement funding levels, dropped the poison pill riders in the bills, and passed real bills for the American people. This year, we know exactly where we need to be to pass bills. They need to be bipartisan, and they need to be 1% higher than the FY24 bills, consistent with the FRA agreement. Marking up bills like the Milcon VA bill before us today that have no chance of becoming law, frankly, is a waste of time. On the military construction side, this bill cuts funding for service members and their families by $718 million compared to the enacted level, compared to current services. If we are mathing, a cut is the opposite of an increase. Suggesting that this bill, because it proposes more spending than what the president proposed, and that is somehow an increase, even though the bill cuts the funding level from last year, is Republican math. And, I mean, we have a recruitment and retention problem, and Republicans are cutting funding for military construction. We have a major quality of life program for our service members and their families, and Republicans are cutting funding for military construction. We are in a climate crisis, and Republicans are cutting dedicated funding for resiliency and including harmful policy riders, preventing the implementation of executive orders on climate change and clean energy. Furthermore, neglecting to continue dedicated funding to protect our installations from climate change is a national security risk. We all know how extremely costly disaster recovery funding is. We've had to pass emergency supplemental appropriations bills to fund it, and we have an opportunity to get ahead of that. Last year, we provided DOD with $30 million in dedicated funding for resiliency, a comparatively small sum of funding now, which will pay huge dividends in the future and ensure our national security in the face of our changing climate. By eliminating the dedicated resilience funding this year, this bill would threaten future military readiness. But perhaps the most egregious part of this bill is the partisan riders that it includes. We never used to put partisan riders on this bill. You know, maybe one or two that were traditional debates that we had. But there are riders on this bill that include preventing the VA from implementing its interim final rule on abortion, which is now final, by the way, to provide abortion services under limited circumstances and abortion counseling, and to ensure that veterans have equal access to health care, regardless of what state they live in, especially in a time when reproductive rights are under attack around the country. A woman's decision on whether or not to have an abortion should be made between her and her doctor and her family. It should not be made by the people in this room. It includes riders that do everything from prohibiting the VA from implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and training, to a petty, bigoted prohibition from flying the pride flag over VA facilities. To add insult to injury, we're doing that during Pride Month. From protecting people who speak or act under the guise of religious freedom, essentially authorizing the arbitrary discrimination against the LGBTQI+ community, and from prohibiting access to gender-affirming care, just to name a few, all aimed to disenfranchise veterans from VA. The United States did not make exceptions to the promises we made service members in exchange for their service and sacrifice. We made promises to everyone. This bill undermines VA's ability to report a beneficiary to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System to keep guns out of the hands of those who are prohibited under federal law from purchasing or possessing firearms. It is prohibiting VA from following the law that is intended to protect veterans and those around them. It is prioritizing protecting guns over protecting veterans. It is truly a shame that this bill includes these poison pill riders, because absent these riders, I know that we could work together, and I'm sure in a few months we will, and come to an agreement on a bipartisan basis, just like we have come together in conference. There are over 100 amendments filed to the Milcon VA bill, and so many of them will only add to the chaos and division. They create division between us when we all should have a shared goal of providing health care and benefits to veterans. We need to reject these partisan riders and work together to do what's best for veterans, service members, and their families. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back, Chair. Thanks, Gentlelady. Thank you both for being here for your testimony. I'm going to save my questions till the end and recognize the Gentlelady from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank you both for being here today. Just wanted to maybe ask Mr. Carter a little bit about, what do you think are the areas where you could come together that you have common agreement on in the bill?
Well, we come together on almost everything we work on. The issues are, quite honestly, the riders that we've put in the bill. These are things that our members feel very strongly about, and therefore, and we feel like that it's bad policy that created this environment, and therefore we are trying to correct, in many instances, bad policy. And that's the way, from our opinion. And this is all about our opinion in our districts.
Yep.
And so some of those things you can compromise, and some things you can't.
And maybe you could just give me a little bit of history, because I wasn't here while President Trump was in office, but were there riders put on bills then that maybe the Democrats, that we opposed, that the Democrats wanted, that they put on? If you recall?
I don't recall.
Okay, all right. I'm just wondering if you had the history.
I was probably at Homeland about that time.
Okay.
Homeland chairman, and there was so much garbage on Homeland, it was hard to.
I mean, I can just add on the Milcon VA bill, no, we didn't have.
None.
Not on the Milcon VA.
None whatsoever. Okay.
I've been in the role of ranking member or chair of this subcommittee since 2014.
Okay.
So even before President Trump was in office, this has not traditionally been a bill that really had a lot of partisan riders. We always have the issue with Guantanamo Bay, and that's not related, that's no relevancy to this bill, but we do always have that in the bill one way or the other. And that's really the only partisan rider that I can recall. I mean, it's not even a partisan rider, it's just a traditional argument that we have in this bill. But we don't have sort of extracurricular political additions to this bill typically, except in the last couple of years.
Okay.
I do think the Hyde Amendment was included quite a bit back then.
That's been around for a long time. So, yeah, that would have been.
Not in our
But for the most part, this bill has policies that both sides can support. I mean, we're talking about health care for veterans, we're talking about benefits and, a lot of priorities. So I would think that for the most part, this is a bill that both sides could support and to help veterans. So just a few little things that the majority would like to see on the bill are an issue. And it wasn't, I mean, you mentioned Guantanamo Bay, and so, yes, there was at least one thing that was controversial at least, but with that, I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back to her. Thanks. The gentlelady chair recognizes Ranking Member McGovern for any questions.
Yeah, no, I think as both the chairman and the ranking member pointed out, there are areas that we could come together and agree on and pass a bipartisan MilCon appropriations bill. The problem is all these partisan riders. I mean, that my friends feel compelled to load up on every appropriation bill. I'm not going to have a lot of questions, just simply because this is going nowhere until these riders are dropped. We know that we've seen this movie before. We saw it last year, and now it's come back with a vengeance, and here we are. But Ms. Wasserman Schultz, I mean, you and I both know this could have been a bipartisan process, but unfortunately, this bill is so full of riders, we don't have enough hours in the day to go through all of them. I would like to emphasize just one, and just ask you about it. Can you talk about how this bill treats abortion access and reproductive care for our veterans?
Yes, I can. So the provision in the House bill limiting veterans' access to abortions, it's another example of a poison pill rider that moves this historically bipartisan bill further from a final agreement. We know that this is not going to be included in the bill when all is said and done, because this bill can't pass with this provision in it. What the VA did is it put in place in its interim final rule a rule that said, this is back in September of 2022, and by the way, that rule is now final, in an effort to address the Dobbs decision, which reversed longstanding federal policy that ensured protection of abortion care in the United States. And what the VA did was it said, no matter where a veteran is getting services, if the life or health of the mother, in the cases of rape or incest, or if the life or health of the mother is at risk, then a veteran would have access to abortion care. The bill removes the authority that the VA needs to provide that health care and only allows the abortions in the case of rape, incest, or the life of the mother. In other words, a woman has to be dying under this bill in order to be able to get access to an abortion. Never mind if an abortion is determined to be in her best medical interests based on her conversations with her doctor, her health care provider, unless she's dying, under this bill would have no ability to consult with her and make sure that a pregnancy could be terminated if it threatened her health. I mean, I don't know how it's 2024 and women are still fighting for our reproductive rights. And I'd like to know why anyone in this room believes that they have the authority to make a personal life-altering decision for another person. These decisions should be made between the patient and their doctor, not judges, not politicians, nor the government. Should be all up in our business, and certainly not all up in veterans' business who have defended our country, laid their life on the line, and then we take away their rights and their healthcare decisions, their personal healthcare decisions, which this bill does.
Yeah, I think this is just really shameful. Again, we can go through all the riders. We'd be here all night. But again, this is a missed opportunity. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern, and I would recognize Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. One question, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, that I have for you is on the top line number, you said that it spends more or less than Joe Biden requested, President Biden?
Well, what I said was that this bill cuts funding from what we spent last year. I know it's interesting and cute to suggest that, I mean, in our process, the president proposes, no matter who's president, and the Congress disposes. That's what the appropriations, the president's budget is a blueprint. And then the Appropriations Committee, we make the decisions about the appropriate spending levels. So to be clear, last year, we spent $718 million more than you in this bill propose. That is a cut by anyone's definition.
Yeah, I'm not averse to cuts.
When it comes to making sure that we can retain our military service members, when it comes to making sure we can take care of our veterans, a cut is certainly going in the wrong direction in achieving that goal.
But one thing I thought I heard you say that I just wanted clarification on, and I do agree with you that Congress should appropriate not the White House, but the White House does send suggestions.
Right.
You're saying this bill spends more for Milcon and VA than the White House suggestion?
Like what regularly occurs, yes. We usually, no matter who is president, we usually, for our bill, on both the Milcon side and the VA side, we usually appropriate more funding than any president normally proposes. But this bill, but we also make sure that we increase what we do spend from one year to the next when Democrats are in charge. Instead, this bill cuts funding from what was appropriated last year.
Judge Carter, is she correct that this bill spends more on Milcon VA than President Joe Biden requested?
That's right.
That's correct, okay. I don't know what to make of that, actually, but I think it's interesting. It's going to be hard to demagogue Republicans on this, on veterans' benefits, if it spends more than President Joe Biden requested. I just think that's an interesting situation.
Mr. Massey, you
yes.
understand, he asked, we make the decisions.
Correct.
And the Constitution is very clear on that. In fact, you'll not find anywhere in the Constitution that the president submits a budget.
Well, I agree with you 100%, and I even went so far as to, when Trump was president, to say that once we appropriate it, he can't move it around. And some Republicans got mad at me for that. But I agree with you that the power of the purse is sacrosanct, and it sits here in Congress. I just wanted to clarify.
Mr. Massey?
Yes, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, please.
Thank you so much. Military construction, when compared to last year in this bill, cut by $718 million. And discretionary funding for Veterans Affairs, that's the non-mandatory side, has been cut by $6 billion. So, I mean, these are real cuts. They will harm military readiness and impact the quality of life of our service members as well as our veterans. I mean, so if you're dealing just in the world of the appropriations process being the responsibility of the Congress, apples to apples, last year we spent more money than under a Republican budget, and the final amount that we agreed to then is being appropriated in this proposed bill. It has nothing to do with what the president proposed, because like I said, you could go back to the Trump budgets, and we also appropriate more than the Trump budgets proposed. That's pretty typical.
Okay, thank you. Just to close out this chapter, it spends more than Joe Biden wanted to spend on veterans. Is that correct, Judge Carter?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on. I know there are a lot of riders here. There's one I'm somewhat familiar with, and I heard you, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, discuss it in your opening testimony, and that's on the NICS background check system. Can you explain to me what your aversion is to that rider, what your concern is?
Yeah, when you have a veteran who has been referred to a fiduciary to take over their finances, that means that they are actually prohibited by federal law from buying or possessing a gun. And this bill carves out an exception and prevents the VA from referring a veteran who would otherwise not be able, under federal law, to purchase or possess a gun to continue to do so. And that's dangerous to the veteran. We already have a really serious suicide problem, and almost always when a veteran commits suicide, it is because they have a gun. And this bill endangers the lives of veterans and of their loved ones.
So I have actually talked to veterans who've been affected by this rule. It's not a federal law, and so I find it appropriate that we just talked about the power of Congress to appropriate. Now let's talk about the power of Congress to make law, because Congress never made a law that said if you have a fiduciary for your finances, that you now can't own a gun. That's something the liberals over at the VA created during Obama, and it's been going on a long time. I've had whistleblowers call me about this who work in the VA. They actually do these interviews. They talk to the veterans, and typically what happens is a veteran may be 25 or 50% disabled, and they apply for 90% or 100% disability, and they go through an interview. And in that interview, if they make the mistake, when they're asked the question, do you manage your own finances? If they're thinking, well, my wife has the checkbook, if it's a man, and they say that, that box gets checked, that they do not manage their own finances. That should not be an adjudication of whether somebody should give up their Second Amendment. In fact, not only is that person now added to the Brady list, there can't be a gun in the household. Not only can they not buy a gun, they can't have a gun in the household. So now the spouse is deprived of protection. We're talking about somebody who's 90% disabled, a veteran who was willing to risk their life for this country. And now because somebody in an interview checked the box because they said their wife has the checkbook, now they can't own a gun? This is not due process. And I know this for a fact. I've talked to multiple people that work at the VA who've gone through these interviews. I've talked to veterans. I've talked to veterans' wives who've been through this. And you say there's a process. I see the president's statement on this bill says, oh, there's a process to go through. No, it involves years. It involves lawyers, which most of these folks, if you're applying for disability and you're a veteran on a fixed income, you don't have $20,000 to go pay a lawyer to try to get your rights back because you accidentally, because you were truthful, it wasn't an accident, you just didn't know that telling the person giving you the interview that your wife has the checkbook would put you on the Brady list. Now, here's the other reason they don't appeal it. They get that letter that says you've been added to the Brady list at the same time they get their approval for their disability. And the implication, it comes the same day. The implication is if you contest this, you may lose your disability benefit. You were willing to put your life on the line for this country, and now some bureaucrat adjudicated you to not manage your own finances, and then some rule, not a federal law, some rule that the VA came up with says that if you don't manage your own checkbook, now you can't own a gun. It's ridiculous. One of these whistleblowers told me he went to the person's house and the guy's literally trading stocks on his computer. Like, he's not mentally defective. He just admitted that he doesn't have the checkbook. And so this is something that we did, I think we did a CRA on this, but obviously the president was a Democrat at the time, wasn't going to sign it. And also, when Trump became president, the clock had run out on this, so you couldn't do a Congressional Review Act on this. And it is long past time to quit taking guns from disabled veterans merely because their wife, or if it's a female, their husband, has the checkbook.
Mr. Massey?
Yes, Ms. Wasserman Schultz. I want to ask you a question first.
Sure.
Do you think that's a fair way to adjudicate this? Do you think if somebody doesn't manage their own finances, they should automatically, without a judge, be put on a list to say they can't have a firearm?
I think you're mischaracterizing the process, first and foremost, because it's not just, oh, my husband manages our finances, but he is not my...
Don't tell the VA that.
No. I'm happy to tell the VA that because...
They'll take your guns.
Because he's not appointed as my fiduciary. This is a formal adjudication in which a veteran has a fiduciary appointed to manage their finances. That is not a bureaucrat, as you described them, sitting down with a veteran and reviewing, oh, does your wife manage your finances? And they check a box and then suddenly their guns are taken away. That is not how the process works. You have to have a formal adjudication. And beyond that...
Is a judge involved?
I'm not familiar with the process.
A judge is not involved.
Okay. I'm not 100% sure how a fiduciary is established. I believe it's a judge, but it is not the way you are describing, where they sit down and have an interview and their wife manages their finances and they lose their guns. In addition to that...
Well, just let me interrupt, and then I'll give you more time.
There's also a appeals process that allows them, before their guns are taken away from them, they are able to appeal.
You're correct. You did say it's a lengthy appeals process. It's so lengthy, it may never end, and it's
lengthy
expensive.
in the sense that it is a rigorous one that makes it hard for the final decision to be that the veteran loses their guns.
I think it's ironic we use the word adjudicate when there's no judge involved. And the administration tried to do the same thing with Social Security. If you had a representative payee, if your Social Security check went to somebody else, they tried to promulgate a rule that said everybody on Social Security that has a representative payee is now going to be thrown into the next background check system.
Mr. Massey.
Not only does that mean you can't buy a gun when you go fill out your Form 4473 and they run the check on you, it means you are a felon when you sit at home with the guns you already own, or if your spouse has a gun that you can get access to when they're not home, then you're a felon. They tried to do this the thing they're doing at the VA,
This doesn't make them a
they tried to do, oh, really? If you're on the prohibited list, the Brady list,
That's when, if you have a fiduciary appointed for you, that does not make you a felon.
really?
Yes, really.
What about when you get
Meaning
the,
that somebody is responsible for managing your finances.
well, I think,
Informed.
I think you're about to learn something
We have a
here.
rampant suicide problem
No.
with veterans.
What happens
They
is,
use their guns,
they,
kill themselves.
no, you just said, you're saying it's not a crime once you're a veteran and you own a gun and you get on that fiduciary list?
No, what I'm saying is that having a fiduciary appointed for you does not make you a felon, and you don't get a fiduciary appointed for you because you're a felon.
That's correct.
There
You
are
don't
three
get a
criteria.
hold on. That's correct. You don't get a fiduciary because you're a felon. But right now,
It's not the
at
only
the
criteria.
at the
in which somebody gets their
VA,
guns taken away.
the only criteria is if you get on that fiduciary list, then you get on the Brady list. You get the letter when they approve your benefits. I went through this with
Okay.
at least two people, I'll yield you some time here. Two people that work at the VA that told me this is exactly how it works. I talked to a distraught wife who's been battling this for a couple years to try and get, not just her husband, the veteran's guns rights back, but just her right to have a gun in the house. And this is what happens. They don't, it's not an easy process to get off of this. And the veterans typically, as was explained to me by the people that work at the VA, I will call them whistleblowers, the veterans typically don't try to appeal. A lot of them will just try to keep their gun and stay under the radar, illegally keep their gun, because the same day they get the letter that said, we approved you moving from 50% disability to 90 or 100% disability, they get the letter. In fact, it may be in the same envelope, I'm not sure, that says, now you're on the Brady list. You will be a criminal if you have access to a firearm.
Mr. Massey, there are three criteria that are used to determine whether somebody is ineligible to purchase a firearm. One, you have to be a felon. Two, you have to be a domestic violence abuser. And three, you have to be adjudicated as mentally ill. And one of the ways in which someone has a fiduciary appointed for them is when there is a mental illness. You don't just easily get declared that you are incapable of handling your finances and a fiduciary is appointed for you. There is generally a serious problem in which the veteran needs intervention and a fiduciary is appointed to them, which is aligned with when someone is adjudicated as mentally ill, they are not able to purchase a weapon. And the reason that that is so important to make sure that we leave that in place when it comes to a veteran is so that we don't add to the veteran suicide rate and we don't add to the number of veterans that are killing their own family members or that are engaging in violence with firearms.
What you say can be true, that somebody who is found to be mentally ill is then assigned a fiduciary and then loses their gun rights. But it can also happen that somebody is not found to be mentally ill, that all they have is a fiduciary. They tried to do this exact same thing at the Social Security Administration, and we stopped them here in Congress, I believe with the CRA, Congressional Review Act. but we weren't able to do it at the VA. People who are not mentally ill are being put on the list of people who will be criminals if they keep their guns or try to buy a gun or even have ammunition in the house. And rather than beat a dead horse here, I'm just going to close my comments by saying this is a very needed rider, and I would hope more people would get educated on this, talk to your veterans, talk to somebody who's lost their gun rights, who's not mentally ill, who was simply trying to get their disability because they were willing to put their life on the line for this country, and now they can't even exercise their Second Amendment. So I support that rider, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for questions.
Thank you. As Rep. Wasserman Schultz noted, of the 12 appropriations bills, the Milcon VA bill has historically been one of the easiest to get through because it hasn't gotten loaded up with these poison pill riders. I mean, there's always a lot of bipartisan support for the bill, fixing dilapidated military housing, making sure there's childcare for our troops. These are all important objectives that we should be supporting, particularly for the people who've provided such important service to the country. But we've seen, unfortunately, again this year, it looks like we're going down this path where our colleagues who are of the more extreme variety are going out of their way to politicize what should not be a politically fraught bill, and thereby jeopardizing funding for veterans and service members. By loading up this bill with these partisan poison pill policy riders, they've made the bill a non-starter, and we all know the riders are going to have to come out eventually for the bill to pass into law. So once again, we're wasting time with legislation that isn't going to go anywhere. It's particularly offensive that these extremists would prevent the VA from providing comprehensive reproductive health care to women vets. Women vets should get the health care they need, not the health care that Republican politicians want them to have. Republican extremists have made our veterans another front in their culture wars against women's freedoms and their health, and it's just not acceptable. This bill also continues the odd obsession we saw with last year's appropriations bills with trying to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion programs wherever they exist. And this is despite the long-standing and well-documented history of discrimination in our military against women, against people of color, against the LGBTQ members of our society. And so I don't think it's crazy that we should want the VA to address this historic challenge and to provide inclusive and culturally informed care to the citizens who've served our country. So, the Republican majority doesn't seem to care about this. They just want to be able to yell about banning DEI so they can appease the right-wing extremists who seem to be running their party at this point, and it just is bad policy. I was going to ask you a couple questions about the NICS system and who is getting banned from it when they are declared incompetent under this procedure, but I think we've already beaten that horse to death. So I will yield back. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina for questions.
Both of you, appreciate you coming. Judge Carter, this is more money than what Biden asked for?
Generally, it always is,
Okay, now,
because we make decisions based upon where the needs are necessary, and they, quite honestly, have the power of the earmarks by their offer of what we should spend. They have no authority to put a budget before us and tell us what to spend. The Congress makes that decision, not the president. And so you'll find that when the president proposes something we disagree with, we may move money around, and that would make the change in the numbers one way or the other. But we're not locked in to the president's budget, and we never will be locked in one way or the other. Now, if the Congress passes a lock-in, we're locked in.
right. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, you mentioned bipartisanship. Now, we just have a basic disagreement. I know you refer to abortion as health benefits. Killing a child is not health benefit. We just have a basic disagreement on that. The NICS program, we got an Air Force base, got a base in my district in South Carolina. What Thomas is talking about, that's literally happening. You take
A base or a VA facility?
no, the NICS system, where if you check that your wife is handling your finances, which a lot of veterans do, they've been gone, fighting wars, and they've been tied up in military-type things. So I suggest you may want to talk to some veterans, what he's talking about when they check the wife or someone else going over he's just being truthful, as Thomas said. Secondly, now, is it bipartisanship, like on the DEI, do you have the number that we're cutting out with these riders?
A number that you're cutting on,
By eliminating diversity, equity, and inclusion, what number does that mean?
I believe, if my recollection is correct, out of the pot of funding that you're cutting $10 million. Is that right? I think it's $10 million for DEI programs. And by the way, the CRT rider, there is nothing to do with CRT at the VA. It's an irrelevant partisan rider that has nothing to do with our bill because the VA doesn't have anything related to CRT in anywhere in the agency. And I mean, if you cut this $10 million, Mr. Norman, what you're doing, it's not just that you are cutting programs that help make sure that we have culturally appropriate programs that ensure that we can have a seamless way of interacting with all kinds of veterans that cross the threshold. It's also important to deal with the diversity of the employees that we have at the VA. So, I mean, my whole point is that this rider is not going to stay in this bill. It isn't necessary. It's just a partisan culture war rider that undermines our typical ability. That's why we're first. We're always first up in Milcon VA because we have so much agreement and we're all rowing in the same direction to try to take care of our service members and our veterans. And adding poison pills like this prevents us from doing that.
If this administration is going to cut anything where we have a real partisan divide on, DEI is one of them. And again, I've got a military district in South Carolina. The 30% deficit in people volunteering for the military is because of this DEI, one of the things that they're sick of. That's not military related. What about the prohibit the VA from processing medical claims for illegal aliens? What's your stance on that, and do you know the dollar amount that's being cut out?
I don't recall the dollar amount off the top of my head, but that's not actually what they're doing. They have an arrangement with ICE that they handle the data management. It's an administrative function. They essentially serve as a third party.
But my question, so you're in favor of this rider prohibiting the VA in
No.
whatever form it is from?
No, I'm not.
Oh, you're not
because-
for that?
No.
Okay, then that's a divide that we will
But
never
again, it
cross.
has nothing to do with us providing resources to our veterans and our service members. It has nothing to do with making sure that we can recruit and retain our service members or improve the quality of life. It's just a poison pill political rider just to, satisfy the extremists in the Republican Party. And it's not going to help pass this bill.
Ask a veteran if they're in favor of letting illegals into the U.S. military. I think
It
they
has
would take.
nothing to do with what you are eliminating in this bill.
Okay. You know the
Nothing.
dollar amount that that would involve?
I'm happy to provide it for you,
Okay.
but it is nothing
What
to do
about-
with allowing undocumented immigrants. And what they do, let's be very clear, Mr. Norman, the VA is essentially providing an administrative function because they are a large agency and they are providing an administrative function to ICE. It's important to note, well, I'll go back to that in a second. This is not related to that.
Okay.
Thank you. All the VA does is it serves as like a third-party administrator for ICE to process data. They don't have anything to do with allowing undocumented immigrants into the country. Nothing.
But
And so
then
this
you
is-
should-
This is just a culture war rider.
Okay.
They are performing an administrative function that they have performed for a long time.
But you shouldn't be if you're in favor of allowing illegals to come into our military. That's just a basic divide that we have.
I'm not in favor of that. And
Then you
that-
shouldn't be involved, you shouldn't be opposed to this rider
What I'm saying
language.
is that your description of what service the VA provides to ICE is completely inaccurate compared to what they're actually doing.
Okay. What about Guantanamo Bay?
There's nothing whatsoever to do with Guantanamo Bay in this bill. In fact, neither President Trump nor President Biden have asked to continue the language that has been inserted in this bill in any of their budgets. So, I mean.
But are you for closing Guantanamo Bay or not? Would you be okay with that? Assuming it's in this for some reason. Judge Carter, let me ask you to comment
He
on
will
that.
agree with you.
I'm not for, but let me,
It's got nothing to do with this bill. There's no language
it's
in
gonna
this
be
bill at all.
bizarre, but she's right about this position that we have with, we contract with ICE to do some work for them.
But there's dollars involved, is that not right?
Their dollars, not the veterans' dollars, their dollars.
ICE pays.
ICE pays us for processing their collections. It's just as simple as it can be. It's been done for a long time. This is not a new thing. Now, in Guantanamo, I know the reason to be there, and I want to be there, and I remain steadfast on Guantanamo that we need to keep it open and available to keep evil people from killing Americans.
Right. And it's coming out of,
DOD
well,
issue.
it's DOD issue, but it's
Got
tax,
nothing to do with this
it's
bill.
still tax dollars.
Not any tax dollars in this bill. There is no relationship,
But within the DOD, it's tax dollars.
but not in this, not the tax dollars that we appropriate in this bill. There is no association with Guantanamo Bay and the housing of prisoners there in the Milcon VA
Yeah,
bill.
we don't have any.
None.
What about the abortion language that you're opposed to? I guess that does involve funding dollars that's in this rider. I've never heard a physician take the position that if the life of a mother was in danger, they would not do what they needed to do to save the life of the mother.
But this bill prohibits the implementation of the final rule adopted by VA to ensure, you have to be dying under this provision. If a veteran isn't dying, then she's not going to be able to get an abortion. And if her, in consultation with her healthcare provider, if her healthcare provider says it is medically necessary to preserve her health, like, for example, if my fertility, God forbid, were affected if I didn't have an abortion, which for many women, Mr. Norman, occurs when they have a life-altering problem with their pregnancy. Many times, women are made infertile if they carry their pregnancies, and they're told by their healthcare provider, if this pregnancy isn't terminated, then your future ability to have a child is impacted. Veterans deserve the ability to make those decisions that affect their health with their healthcare provider. Not Mr. Norman, not Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the woman, her family, and her healthcare provider. And no woman should have her future health or her current health impacted by a politician deciding that she can't have access to a healthcare procedure that would preserve her health.
Take health of the mother out of it. What about a perfectly formed baby, 3 months into the pregnancy, aborting it? Should the VA pay for that? In your
Who should
opinion?
make that decision?
Right, if she
is
made
a
the decision,
family-
should that be a VA? I'm asking you. If she makes that decision midterm with a healthy baby, should she be able to abort the child?
The VA already, when it comes to rape, incest, and the
I
life
get,
of the
okay,
mother,
take
that's
that.
already the
I'm
case.
talking about a perfectly healthy baby midterm. If a woman decides it's time for an abortion, she doesn't want the child, should that
It's
be
not
in?
applicable under this rule. It has to affect the life or health of the mother. This rule, the final rule adopted by the VA, you cannot have a perfectly healthy mother who's a veteran and carrying a perfectly healthy pregnancy, and that abortion be provided.
That's
at the
stopped
VA.
anyway.
That cannot happen.
Okay. Judge Carter, do you agree with that?
Right.
All right, what about the climate change, I guess, funding dollars that comes out of this?
Resiliency
What kind of dollars are we talking about there?
is $30 million.
30 million?
Right.
So climate change ought to be,
I'll give you an example. When Hurricane Michael hit the Panhandle in Florida.
Hit what?
Hurricane Michael
Okay.
hit the Panhandle in Florida. There used to be a policy that the only way that you could rebuild our infrastructure after it was taken out by a natural disaster is we used to only be able to rebuild it to the existing standard. You could only bring it back up to existing standards. We eventually realized, especially with how devastating Michael was on the Panhandle, and the Tyndall Air Force Base and other military bases that it hit, that it was stupid fiscally for us to leave that in place, and that we wanted to make sure that we could build in resiliency to our infrastructure so that we weren't, doing the same thing over and over again, rebuilding infrastructure to the way it was before and not have it withstand the forces of nature. So taking out the funding that provides our ability to build in that resiliency, no matter why you think climate change is happening, man-made, natural, artificial, whatever, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. And so providing the funding, the critical funding for resiliency, is a national security issue.
well, it depends on what your definition of resiliency is. You're talking about
Strengthening and hardening.
You're talking about repairing damage done by a hurricane or.
Yes, building in resiliency to our.
But where there's a big difference.
We deal with
is-
military infrastructure.
where-
That's what we do.
Yeah, but that's, the 30 million I assume you're talking about is the dollars that go into to Never Never Land. We don't know what it is, other than
No.
you're going to stop, man's actions are going to stop hurricanes, they're going to stop storms. Is that true, Mr. Carter?
We can build, we have to build resiliency in places where, turns out, we got flooded. I mean,
How do you define
a
resilience?
bigger building, a hurricane-proof building, instead of building a World War II building. I don't call that, I don't really consider that to be what she's talking about. But I do say that you learn, even in your own house, you learn if you build in a floodplain and you flood, you either move or you build a flood-proof house up on stilts. Well, that's just common sense.
Well, you can't, you solve
That
that
has
by
nothing
not,
to do with-
you solve that by not building in a floodplain.
Yeah,
Now,
but
you can
that was
shrink
built in
them.
the floodplain a long time ago.
Generations ago.
And and you warn against it, and you get insurance against it and all that stuff. But the real world of that particular military post, is it has to be changed, or it ultimately will be ineffective if another hurricane hits.
I get that, and I get the beefing the building
That
up
has
to
nothing
sustain
to do,
it.
really, I don't view that as the issue you have in dispute on climate change.
Well, I was just saying, the areas that we've got just a whole difference of opinion on is the money going to climate change to prevent hurricanes, to prevent not building structures that will withhold it. The other thing is on illegals, aliens, where the process, and if it's not applicable to this, but just the process of doing that, somebody's paying for that, is, and along with all the other things, is why we've got a division, we've got a military that's 30% below what, if you talk to veterans, they will tell you this stuff that you disagree with is why they're not joining the military. What Thomas talked about, the NICS program, that's happening. Talk to veterans. Maybe you have, but they're different in South Carolina than they are here. They're tired of the wokeness. They're tired of dollars that are not being spent for actual military preparedness, and they're sick of it. If we're spending more money here
inflating
and cutting the things that I guess you're saying, Debbie, are not relevant to, don't have dollars attached to them.
Not even
But
anything
if
to
it's-
peg it to.
Pardon me?
Not even anything to peg it to.
Well, I
There's
saw
no-
Keith shaking his head. He's in
Well, he might be shaking his head, but he would be shaking it incorrectly, because there's nothing whatsoever in this bill that has anything to do with Guantanamo Bay.
I think he would have some comments on that, coming from actual experience on it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Ledger Fernandez.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being here on what would normally be a bipartisan support for military construction and our veterans, especially after, what we've done the last week home, right? We spent a lot of time with our veterans. I spent time at our community, our C-Box with our veterans. I spent time at memorial services on the day of, the week of, the weekend of. And so we did a lot of talking with our veterans. And I think we keep hearing certain things, is that veterans need more services, that they want to be treated with the dignity and respect that they have earned, because it's not enough when we fly a flag and say thank you for your service, but then don't provide them with the services they deserve. Don't you agree?
I do, and we
yes,
do.
which is
I do, and we do.
Yeah, we do, and I really, was able to stand there and talk to them about how Democrats, when we were in charge, we increased the VA funding by probably a total of 19 and then 23, so close to 40%. Like we really put, like we both honored that flag and then we added the funding, right, to make it mean something. And so that's the situation we're in, right, where we've had this support coming from Democrat leadership for veterans in the last Congress. And here we are with a bill that, as we've heard, has riders. And one of the things that strikes me is that it shouldn't matter what state you live in, or it shouldn't matter what zip code you live in, that a veteran, wherever they live, deserves the right to have health care. Wouldn't you agree that wherever you live, you deserve the right to have the same kind of health care as a veteran anywhere else in the country?
I agree.
Right. Ranking member.
But I don't think you have the right. You're addressing her or me?
No, that's fine. You agree. I think that that's a really important thing.
But I agree that you don't have, you have the right to go get an abortion.
Right.
You just don't have the right to government to pay for it.
Well, this is a different issue that we're facing, and I think that this is the issue that Representative Wasserman Schultz has been trying to get at, is that the reality is when you are pregnant. Have you ever been pregnant?
No, ma'am.
You've never been pregnant. Let me tell you, I have been pregnant. I have been pregnant. I have 3 children. And I almost died. I almost died when I was pregnant. And I had to make a decision when I was pregnant as to whether I would continue with a pregnancy or whether I would take some medical care that could have killed me, but would have protected my baby. I made that decision in consultation with my own God. I made that decision in consultation with my own doctor, and I made that consultation with my own familia. I didn't have anybody else telling me what I could or could not do. And that was a choice about whether I'd be able to have a pregnancy again or not. It was a difficult choice, but guess who got to make it? Me. And what you're suggesting and where you're doing with this overturning of this rule is saying it's not going to be, if I were a servicewoman and that was the only place I could get help because I happen to live in Texas or happen to live in Florida. Somebody else would have made that decision. And I cannot sit here and support a bill that takes that decision away from the woman. And that's what we're talking about when we say this is not right. Representative Wasserman Schultz, is there anything you want to add to that perspective?
Yes. 2 important things, because I want to make sure that we put the finest point possible on this. One is that the final rule implemented by the VA only allows an abortion to be provided for rape and incest and the life or health of the mother. If I decide, if I live in a state where abortion, does not have the extreme restrictions, as Republicans argued that this is a decision that should be made in the states. Well, one, we want to make sure, and this rule is designed to ensure that no matter what state you live in, if you are a veteran and you get your health care from the VA, that it shouldn't matter if you are raped or a victim of incest or have your life in danger or your health in danger, it shouldn't matter what state you live in and what the abortion policy is in that state. When you get your care from the VA, you should be able to have, in consultation with your medical provider at the VA, have a pregnancy terminated based on whether you were raped, a victim of incest, or you want to protect your life or your health. That's what the interim final rule does. Then, when it comes to what kind of abortion care you can get at the VA at all, there's been a few people who have been throwing around, cavalierly, well, now the VA just allows abortion on demand, or now, anyone can just any veteran can just get an abortion for any reason. No, the final rule only allows an abortion for rape, incest, the life or health of the mother in consultation with their medical provider. So using the politics of abortion and intentionally describing it as much more expansive is wrong, and also misplacing the place, as you said, as the gentlewoman from New Mexico said, that misplacing where the appropriate place for these decisions to be made, and that is with a woman, her family, her faith, and her medical provider.
Right, and I think that's really important to talk about the health of a woman, because pregnancy involves the health of a woman.
Right.
And there's all kinds of issues related to that health that we're not going to be able to decide in this room, but that need to be decided in the doctor's room, in the doctor's office, or in the hospital. I stood there with 5 different medical providers watching me to make sure I wouldn't die when I chose the procedure, which could have taken my life, but also could have allowed me to have the beautiful baby that I now have, right? And so this is not something that's theoretical for women across the country. This is something that is very real. And I want to make sure that our women who are willing to give their life for our country, that we are willing to give them the dignity that they deserve. And, I have some other issues around common sense. Thank you very much for raising the issue that resiliency is an issue of common sense, that we need to protect our installations, right? I went to the Blue Continent last summer, and those, so many of those installations are a feet above or a feet below sea level, right?
Florida.
To not, because you're afraid about climate denialism or you want to protect certain industries, that you're unwilling to protect our installations and do more, it doesn't meet the common sense target. And those are the issues that I think are problematic, among many others in here.
Ms. Fernandez,
Yes.
when you were addressed me and asked me if I was pregnant, well, my wife has been pregnant 5 times. And on her 4th pregnancy, she had trouble. And we made a decision that we would go forward and would not terminate the pregnancy. That baby died at 9 months with a birth defect. So I want you to know that a husband has as much feeling and right for what's in your body as a woman does. And the problem with not making it the physical health of the mother, but just the health, means I don't want to live that way, therefore I will have a bad life, I want an abortion. It's a loophole. It's a loophole that opened the way issue to universal abortion. And we're trying not to do that again. We have had to hide for generations. I just put together the original Hyde language in my bill. Health, physical health of the mother. And that blew this whole thing up, because they know that doesn't work. Because then you can't make a choice just for the heck of it. And that's why, or just for...
So, Chairman, I really offer
So
my condolences for
rather
your
insulted
loss.
me,
Yeah.
because my baby died at 9 months. And just the blood test from them poking him in the fingers over that 9 month period of time was $150,000 just for the blood test. And the total amount of cost for that baby was close to the millions of dollars. And I took care of my baby until he died. Because I am the responsible breadwinner of my family. And so don't get on me about, did I ever get pregnant? A man's not supposed to get pregnant. Anything that, in any man that gets pregnant is crazy as a Washington piss in.
So Chairman, I am so sorry for that loss.
No,
I am
no problem.
so, it is something.
Funny when you
These are-
insult people.
Yeah, these are
you forget that
decisions.
They might have gone through something that they
These
know,
are
but they don't.
decisions that are so hard, and what comes after them is so hard and so personal. And so I think
Well,
that's.
mine was personal too.
That is, I think, part of the concern is that you were able to make certain decisions in the loving care of your family. In the loving care of your family, and I think that is what we are asking, is that the love, that there's never going to be, the kind of love that you have is never going to be present anywhere but in that family setting,
Well,
and in that.
We could talk forever,
in
but
that
it
mix.
takes love and care just to, if you don't want a family, don't have one. There's
And-
plenty of ways to not have them. And they're legal, and no baby dies.
So I think that is indeed what we are asking for, is that there
So
will be
this is a
ability
bad
to
way to
have.
go, but I wanted you to know that, because you pissed me off. When you
Well-
asked me if I ever got pregnant, and then rang it off about it didn't affect me. It affected me in a hell of a long way. In a long time, period of my time, I grieved for my child, my boy. But I got a new child after that baby was born. And now I've got 4 healthy, grown children and 7 grandchildren. And they're blessed with every one of them. I'm through preaching.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I think it is important to re-emphasize how these are such difficult decisions, and there's so much love that happens around them and so much pain that happens around them, which is why it is important that they be allowed to be made by those who are most impacted. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, Chair. Thanks, the gentlelady. Gentleman from Texas is recognized for questions.
I thank the chairman. I thank the witnesses for being here. Just a couple of issues. We talked a little bit about the overall spending level earlier. I think the gentleman from Kentucky was asking the question, and I think he was asked and answered that the dollar amount that we're talking about here is greater than the president's budget. It's been discussed. That's maybe not unusual. The president sends it up, and there's appropriations that are different. But nevertheless, it is a fact that the president's budget was less for this than was what we appropriated. Just to confirm, that is correct, right?
That's right.
So it is also correct that the total spending level, for a variety of reasons I'll get into in a minute, is greater than 24, right? The FY25 total spend is greater than FY24 when you account for mandatory spending and advanced appropriations, correct?
Right.
Except that we don't count it that way.
We don't
Well,
count it that way.
We're
well-
responsible for discretionary spending.
Right,
Discretionary
but
spending.
this
We have
is,
nothing to
but this
do
is why I'm
with the
asking though,
mandatory spending.
because here's the issue.
That's more
Mandatory
Republican math.
spending to the tune of roughly $600 billion was adopted by Congress for the burn pits, 2 years ago? And
You're talking about the PAC.
the PACT Act, right, to deal with the burn pit
We have
issue predominantly.
$23
others.
million, $23 billion in the Toxic Exposure Fund on the mandatory side.
The point being, though, a rather significant amount of money was directed into mandatory spending. So when you look at the total impact of what we're dealing for overall veteran spending, when you factor in what we've been doing on mandatory, then with advanced appropriations, the total amount of spending for veterans is going up. And it's just important to know that from just like at my house.
But it's also important to know that we are not discussing mandatory here, and we have when we go through the appropriations process, and maybe we need a little tutorial here.
I fully understand
The
it.
Appropriations
The
Committee.
American people need to understand it,
Yes,
though.
everybody does. We have
Right.
colleagues who need to understand it, perhaps you. When we go through
fully get it.
the 12 appropriations spending bills, we only deal with discretionary spending. And there is no doubt, under any circumstances, that last year, on the VA side, on the military construction side, We spent $718 million more than you are proposing to spend here. That's a cut by anyone's definition and anyone's math. And last year, on the VA side, on the discretionary side, you are cutting what you're proposing by $6 billion.
So, but reclaiming my time, the
spending
overall spending for veterans, when you factor in a massive amount of mandatory spending that this Congress or the previous Congress put in place, that combined with what we're doing on the discretionary side, if anybody was charting this out, like you would at your house on how you're spending at some account, the overall spend for veterans is going up.
That's
And that's
not
no,
in
but just,
the
I mean, just
purview of
mathematically,
how-
it's true though, correct, Mr.
convenient.
Carter? Is that a true
That's
statement?
true.
Mr.
Right.
Roy, it's convenient math for you?
It's
because
not
it makes it
convenient
so that you
math.
can say
No,
there's
no.
an increase, but there's
No,
not.
It's convenient
There's no
math for the
increase.
average American who wants to look at why we're $35 trillion in debt. Because Congress punts to mandatory spending and then acts like they can just ignore it while they then look at discretionary spending. That's the truth. Like, nobody's looking at all this saying, man, your fiscal house is really in order.
But you do understand that the Appropriations Committee does not make decisions
I understand.
about the mandatory.
I understand. We've
side
already
of the
talked
budget.
about it being greater than the president's budget. And my point for the average American out there to
Isn't
understand
in the
when we're
president's
talking about a cut to veterans, that we're talking about overall spend for veterans being higher. That's it. I just want the average American to understand that the overall spend for veterans is higher.
But not in the
And that's-
discretionary side,
but
which
that's-
is what
it's-
this bill is
But it's
in front of us.
critically important to understand that reality because the American people can't seem to understand why we're $35 trillion
There's
in
Republican
debt.
math and there's actual math.
No.
Republican math describes
No,
a
there's
proposal,
actual math.
and the
There's
actual math in this bill
right.
is a cut.
Gentleman from Texas controls the time. Let's try not to talk over each other because it's harder for our awesome clerk to transcribe.
Well, understood that, and reclaiming my time. As a matter of point, as the chairman just pointed out, the total spend for the average American out there listening for veteran spending is going up. The issue here is we have discretionary spending, which is greater than the president's budget, and which we're working on numbers to try to contain overall spending, that the discretionary level at a discretionary number is less than last year's number. As the gentleman from Kentucky said, some of us want to look across the board in all of discretionary spending this way. And the fact is, when we talk about the issues, I think the gentlelady brought up, I think she made a point that critical race theory is not in existence or something along those lines or being pushed at the VA. The fact is, there's a number of different things, but in there's a specific quote in a VA doc, and it cites a journal entry titled "Critical Race Theory, Racial Microaggressions, and Campus Racial Climate" in an entire presentation on what they're trying to put forward. And a lot of this stuff is broadly recognized. There was an entire Wall Street Journal article on this from 2022, the United States government's woke training. This is from December of 2022, so about a year and a half ago. And it talks about the Department of Veterans Affairs as a gender gingerbread person. NASA's got micro inequities, U.S. Army is not VA. Then it goes down to Veterans Affairs. There's a whole slide on it. The VA is managing gender diversity training as sections on pronouns and embracing gender expansiveness. One slide lists terms including gender fluid and pansexual, instructing list your personal biases in the bias box. A game of privilege bingo includes such items as, goes down a whole list of things. And there's like a whole, I can't do, I can't show exhibits in this committee, but there's a genderbread person slideshow. Anyway, my point is, what I think the average American is trying to look at this and came back to my $35 trillion of debt and wanting the VA and the Defense Department to actually do its job is when we just sort of blithely kind of put aside all these, cultural war, I think the ranking member tried to refer to them as riders. The purpose of, and I would ask the chairman, my friend from Texas, the purpose of these policy provisions that are included in the appropriations is to use the power of the purse that Congress has to tell the executive branch, the president, and those that are administering the agencies to say, hey, these are things that we don't think are the highest and best use of taxpayer dollars or the direct focus of the policies that you should carry out. Does the gentleman agree with that framing?
Yes, sir, I agree with that.
And in broad terms, we're talking about things like I just described, that program, and there are dozens of examples that I could use, but for sake of time, I won't, but that are like that. I've got like links upon links upon links. And we've got issues here, and we will say, well, we want to prohibit VA services to illegal aliens. We can have a whole debate on that. We don't need to, but I think the average American that I represent says, yeah, I tend to agree with that. defunding critical race theory. Well, the gentlelady says it's not being used. It's being applied. It's certainly being referenced. There's multiple examples I could bring up. Certainly then in connection with another provision, defunding DEI programs, defunding the COVID vaccine mandates, mask
Can I point
mandates,
something out?
a whole number of things. I will give you time. Yes,
when you
ma'am,
have-
just to finish
Thank
for sake of time. All of these things, and then getting to the overall, climate issue and climate change, it's not just resiliency and making sure that the infrastructure is okay in a floodplain or something along those lines. I mean, we've got, pretty significant mandates sitting there in the VA in terms of green purchasing, electric vehicle purchases, 22,000 of electric vehicle purchases. We have EVs that are piling up on lots because people can't drive where they want to get. A whole lot of people don't think they're the most efficient, effective vehicles. They're mining crap, other, child labor over in Africa and empowering Chinese. All these things that we think might be an important policy consideration when we're talking about the federal dollars that are being put out. So I say all of that to simply say, we put forward a bill that we believe spends more than the president's budget, has an overall spend for veterans that is still going up, and I recognize the gentlelady's point about discretionary versus mandatory. I'm just trying to make a point for the average American that the total spend line is going up. There's a cost to war, and we're dealing with that cost to war, and we put some of it over in the mandatory side. And we had a full debate here in this committee and otherwise about that sort of thing. And we have policy questions here. And this is a debate, no matter who's, if you're in the minority here versus the White House, a different party, you're trying to constrain what you think the president might be doing that isn't consistent with the policies that we think are appropriate for spending levels, and that's what these policy writers are designed to do. And I said I'd give the gentlelady time, and I will.
Thank you very much. Look, I understand that you want to arrive with your description of there being an increase in this bill, but the appropriations, that's a fundamental misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what the Appropriations Committee does. We are responsible for the discretionary spending only. There's no way around the math that in this bill, on the VA side, it's on the Milcon side, it's $718 million less than we appropriated last year, and $6 billion less on the VA side. That's number one. So that's the only thing we deal with. We don't debate the mandatory side in our bill. We deal with the discretionary side.
I agree with everything you just said. The only point I would make is that the total spend is $30 billion higher in total veteran spending. Just want every American to know that.
Congress deals with, unless we're in an authorizing committee.
Right, but how you account for things matters, but I agree.
That's not our bill. Okay, Milcon, the resiliency, I understand that it can be easy and confusing, and I sometimes do it myself, to conflate the two sides of our bill, but we handle military construction and the VA. We're the only committee in the Congress that deals with the entire life cycle of an individual from the beginning of their active duty all the way through their service as a veteran, and then when we bury them. The resiliency cut, the $30 million cut, is not on the VA side. It is $30 million cut from military construction resiliency. We deal with infrastructure. That is what our bill funds. And so when you're talking about a $30 million cut to resiliency, I know you guys don't like the word climate, but what we've described, and the judge and I have both described it, that is less funding available to harden our infrastructure against natural disasters and to make sure that we're not going back later and spending more money and throwing good money after bad. That makes no sense. It's irresponsible, and we should restore that funding, and we probably will in the final analysis.
So okay, real quick.
Last thing, and then I'll be quiet. On the DEI riders, I just want to make sure that people understand what your DEI poison pill rider does, because it also restricts the VA and our military from making sure that people with disabilities or who are pregnant are not discriminated against. So you're preventing, by eliminating this funding for DEI programs, our ability in both sides of the bill to protect people with disabilities and who are pregnant. Those are included in DEI programs. I hope you don't intend to do that, but that's the reality.
Ask the chairman, are diversity, equity, inclusion programs necessary to protect the disabled or those who are pregnant? Or this, as a general rule?
Not in my opinion.
Right. And so, if there's a specific amendment that needs to be done to make sure that's clear, I'm sure we can entertain that. But the bottom line is, for years prior to the existence of diversity, equity, inclusion, or critical race theory, we were able to figure out how to protect individuals. But the bottom line is, we've got multiple issues here that are important for the average American that I certainly represent, and I think the bulk of my colleagues represent. People who believe that we are spending money that we don't have to advance policies that are not in the overall interest and well-being of either the veterans or military construction or overall Defense Department generally. And that's the goal here, is to put stuff out there to say to the president, you got to constrain this, focus where it needs to be focused, and to keep spending where it needs to head as an overall matter. I believe that we've done that, and I certainly compliment the chairman in trying to achieve that objective. And with that, I would yield back to this chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The chair is now pleased to recognize the gentleman from Georgia for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just point out a couple of things. One, the national debt's gone up $3.2 trillion in the last 365 days. That is a concern for every American, I would hope. With regard to health care, the thing that baffles me is so many people in Washington equate higher spending on health care to better outcomes for health care. We spend significantly more today on health care, whether it's inside the VA or outside the VA, than we ever have, and our outcomes are not any better than they were 20 years ago. In fact, I would tell you they were probably better 20 years ago, certainly better per dollar. And I think as long as those of us in Congress equate more spending to better outcomes, we're never going to get control over the cost of health care. The other thing I want to mention before I go to the last thing is what Mr. Massey said about VAs and them taking their weapons away. I know a veteran, and he was asked how much his car payment was or something along those lines, and he said, I don't know, my wife pays the bills. That was what happened, and then they put him on the list. And then he had to go defend himself to get his rights back. Now, the way it might be supposed to work and the way it's actually working on the street with the veterans is very different. And I will tell you, if you do have somebody who actually is fragile, you need them to have a comfort level with talking with the VA about their issues. And they don't have that comfort level because of things like Mr. Massey's described and I've described. I know this guy personally. I hunt with him. And when you take away his right or her right to have a firearm, you've also taken away their right to hunt. Now where I come from, that's a big deal. And people aren't going to give up their granddaddy shotgun. I don't care what the federal law is. They're just not. And so, maybe it is radicals inside the VA that have stretched the bounds of what the law is supposed to be, but the reality on the street is it's happening. The last thing I want to happen is you mentioned veteran suicide. This isn't a trick question, but I know a young man who stepped on a pressure plate, blew both of his legs off. You know what happens if he goes back to work? Even though he's totally and permanently disabled, lost both legs in combat, do you know what happens if he goes back to work? He loses his Social Security benefits. And so in many cases...
His SSI, you mean?
That's right. Mm-hmm. But I'm just telling you, I mean, there are things that this government does. There are stupid rules that we have that need to be fixed. Because if you want to get right down to it, I mean, people being forced to stay at home instead of being allowed to go back to work and end up with less money at the end of the month if they go back to work than they have if they don't, that's a problem. And it's especially a problem for the men and women that are at the tip of the spear in our DOD. And Mr. Roy talked about the mandatory versus discretionary spending. I've got legislation that would fix it. The only reason it hasn't passed is because that issue's in the mandatory spending side of the equation. And so as more and more gets pushed to the mandatory spending side of the equation, like happened with the burn pits, it means we lose control, not just me, but you too. It means we lose control and don't have the ability to do things that 99% of Americans would agree with, such as the fact that if somebody is a combat wounded, total and permanent disabled veteran, they should be able to go back to work and keep their Social Security benefits. So I'm glad we're spending less money than we were. I know this bottle of water isn't health care, but I would just tell you, if you bought it at Walmart, you probably pay 60 cents for it. If you buy it in the airport, you probably pay $3 for it. The VA is not an efficient organization. They are not efficient at healthcare delivery. We absolutely owe our veterans the healthcare that they've earned. And you know what? They're also taxpayers, and they deserve to have it delivered to them in a manner that's efficient. The idea that if we spend more, they get more, it's the problem with this place.
Mr. Scott, do you mind if I just address the last part of what you said?
Sure.
Because when we passed the PACT Act and we put some of that funding into a toxic exposure fund on the mandatory side, it was so that all of the discretionary funding, if you fund all of the costs necessary to ensure that people exposed to toxic burn pits and other toxic exposures who were serving our country, if you put all of that on the discretionary side, then it would chew up most of the funding that is available for all 12 appropriations bills, because 50%, we only have 50, no, it's not, what's the percentage? Very small percentage of what we spend is the discretionary side. And we have lots of needs that we have to take care of. So you have a mandatory side of the ledger so that we can make sure that we have the ability to balance both.
The problem, if I may, is so much has been shifted to the mandatory side of the equation that literally you could virtually eliminate the discretionary side and still have a deficit. And that is where we have a policy disagreement, is that over the years, it has been the Democratic policy to shift more and more to mandatory, which means we don't have discretion as the people's elected officials. And that is a problem from a governance standpoint. It just is. Now, maybe you don't think it is, but I think it is.
What I think is that if you don't use the mandatory side responsibly, then you're basically taking away our ability to make decisions about the discretionary.
Whoa. If you don't, what control does Congress have over the mandatory side of the equation?
We don't have anywhere near the control we have over discretionary.
That's right. That's right.
The discretionary side, then you pass a law that requires us to appropriate funds on the discretionary side, then all of that gets chewed up by the discretionary side, and we don't have enough money to cover the other very serious needs we have.
The more, just factually speaking, the more that gets shifted to the mandatory part of the spending equation, the less control Congress has over it, both from a quality and from a cost standpoint. Would you at least agree with that, that if it's mandatory, that we have very little control over quality and over cost?
What I agree with is that we have to have the appropriate balance between mandatory and discretionary so that all of the requirements that we adopt in the law
Let me ask you this way.
aren't chewed up
If
by
something is
discretionary
mandatory spending, what control do we have as Congress over the cost?
We have authorizing control. We have authorizing.
Once it's mandatory, it's based on a formula.
And we have the ability to change the law. We're the Congress of the United States. We have a Ways and Means Committee that can change that. Every single one of our authorizing.
Has anything ever shifted from mandatory to
You're asking me
discretionary?
whether we have the ability to control it, and the answer is yes. We have authorizing committees that control the changes to the U.S. law, and that's where we're the Congress. We control everything.
No.
We control all of the
No,
laws.
you just argued that it needed to be put in mandatory.
Yes, so that once the decisions are made statutorily.
All right.
Are you on an authorizing committee? Are you on a?
I'm on 2 authorizing committees.
Okay, and so.
3, actually.
In the 3 authorizing committees, you have the ability to change the law and make changes to the statutes that include how we decide mandatory spending, don't you? You have that ability.
We have never been able to.
But it doesn't mean you don't have the power and authority. You just have to, in our process.
All right, listen.
You have to get the majority of members of Congress to go with you in what you propose. That's how our process.
Well, unfortunately, the fact that something's mandatory spending is what's being used as the excuse to not help veterans be allowed to keep their Social Security benefits if they go back to work. Oh, I have proposed a bill, and I I would appreciate if you'd support that piece of legislation.
Send it on.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to stop beating the dead horse. I yield.
Chair appreciates the gentleman yielding back. I had deferred my time for questions, and really, it's not a question, but an observation that I want to leave with both of you. In the 1990s, there was a move away from, well, there was a privatization of base housing, part of the peace dividend
move
of the
away?
1990s. And 30 years has gone by. It's come up over and over again when we do this particular appropriations bill in the Rules Committee. There's been a lot of problems with deferred maintenance, perhaps even some substandard structures. And this is the housing that our enlisted men and their families are living in. So I just urge you as appropriators to pay attention to that. That issue is still important. It doesn't come up today with quite the intensity that it did a few years ago, but it is still important, and we really mustn't fall down on our ability to keep the proper oversight over that. And your subcommittee is the appropriate place to do that, I think.
And Mr. Chairman, we are working on that very diligently to make a correction there.
Absolutely.
We've got issues all over the country with that. Quite honestly, there was a bad planning on that. Back when I first came on this committee, I went out and toured privatized housing, and everybody, soldiers down to, all the way up to generals, were proud of what they had given them. But they did not build in the appropriate repairs that they should have built into the contract. And as a result, like anything else, people will abuse anything they can dodge to do the right thing. I'm sorry, but that's just human nature. I used to do Section 8 housing, not for me, but for my clients. And that particular thing was made the client honest. And I told every one of them, you gotta have a reserve to repair the dwellings, or the dwellings are gonna fall apart. People are not gonna take care of something they don't have ownership in. These people had ownership, but they weren't required to do it. If the soldiers officer told him, fix it, he'd fix it. But he was told, you don't have to fix it. It's part of our contract. And they ignored all the issues. And now we're faced once again with much worse issues than would have been if they'd just gone out and fixed the water heater. And by the way, I have paid for 2 water heaters in the last 60 days. And I paid for them, not my insurance company, unfortunately. But the point is, that's part of life. People will try to take advantage of you, and that's why a good lawyer has to write a good contract.
Mr. Chairman, can I point something out, though? That's another good example of the bipartisan, first of all, you're 100% right. And part of the bipartisan work that we do together is that when we had the crisis a few years ago after the Reuters story and the horrific conditions that were overseen or not overseen by the privatized military housing, what we did in our bill together is we added a layer of funding that we provided to the DOD senior leadership to make sure that they implemented an oversight process on the ground in the military bases so that we could have a, grassroots way of our senior military who are in privatized housing and also barracks now going forward, where they have someone they can go to and get a response right away and are not interminably dialing into 800 numbers that never get answered by the private companies who are making billions of dollars off of our service members.
Well, I appreciate you all keeping up with that.
We're on
It's
top of that.
extremely important, and unfortunately, we've learned if we don't keep our eye on it, it doesn't improve on its own. I want to thank our witnesses for spending so much time with us. This panel is excused.
Thank you very much.
And I want to welcome our second panel, Representative Keith Self and Representative Jason Crow from the Committee on Foreign Affairs. We'll give people just a minute to exit the room, and Representative Self, if you'll join us up here, and we welcome your testimony.
So we are discussing HR 8282.
Representative Self, this is the Rules Committee. 8282 is the subject under discussion, but as you've heard, we can talk about anything you want. So you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't dwell on what we saw on October the 7th, but it was evil, barbaric, 1,200 innocent citizens, over 250 hostages, shocking acts of sexual violence. Nearly 8 months later, we still cannot comprehend the psychotic depravity with which Hamas live-streamed their barbaric actions so that the whole world could see. And the leaders of Hamas have publicly bragged that they will do it again and again if given the opportunity. I say this to remind my colleagues how stunning it is and how twisted it is that the ICC has just filed arrest warrants for Israeli officials. Now, he threw in some Hamas officials, but we know who the targets are. They're the Israeli officials. Just last week, Hamas launched rockets at Tel Aviv to continue this. Israel is a democracy. They have a strong judiciary. They're a strong democracy in the Middle East. They're our strongest ally, certainly in the Middle East, if not in the world. And they have ways to hold people accountable for their acts. Like the United States, Israel is not a party to the Rome Statute, a treaty that established the ICC. For these reasons, the ICC does not have jurisdiction over the United States or Israel. I will point out their claims are based on the idea that something called Palestine has been a member, supposedly a member, for years now. It's urgent that we address this, and quickly. I ask that the Rules Committee get this to the floor. I will tell you from my own personal experience, when the ICC actually was being debated, I was an active duty military officer, and I was in Afghanistan when the Service Members Protection Act was passed. And I will tell you, we were concerned about it because we understood that the international community steps across the line whenever and wherever they choose. And we were concerned that the United States, first of all, might join the ICC, but secondly, if the international community got this authority in the ICC, that they would do whatever they could, because we understand that nations like the United States, the preeminent Western states with the rule of law, would be what they would target. Congress made it abundantly clear through the American Service Members Protection Act of 2002 that the United States would strongly reject interference by the ICC, and that was a vital bill. But in this case, I think that we need to go further. We need to make sure that this illegitimate case against Israel is understood, and we will take action against anyone that tries to overstep their bounds against Israel, and I look forward to your questions.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you for your testimony. Representative Crowe, you're recognized for your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the committee. The world is an increasingly dangerous and volatile place, and America needs friends and allies now more than ever. The bill before us, the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act, will do significant damage to our national security, to American leadership in the world, and prohibit a more measured method of addressing this issue. In short, it is bad for America. I come before you today a combat veteran, a supporter of the American Service Members Protection Act, a longtime supporter of Israel's security, and someone with concerns about the ICC's approach to this case. I also come before you today as someone who believes that America is best when we lead with our values uphold rules-based institutions, and differentiate ourselves from our adversaries. It's for these reasons that I must vehemently oppose this bill. Now, we can debate the issues of jurisdiction and approach, but attacking this court is an egregious overstep that risks our moral authority and our leadership. There are repeated instances in which we have, as a country, recognized that it's in America's interest to support the ICC. An idea the U.S. and this Congress, including members of this committee, have repeatedly recognized. Congress overwhelmingly adopted several pieces of legislation that broadened our ability to provide support for the ICC. Legislation like the Ukraine Invasion War Crimes Deterrence and Accountability Act that many in this room voted for, including an effort led by Chairman Burgess calling on the ICC to act should anything happen to President Zelensky, including a bill that I led in FY23 IAA that mandates the creation of a Russian atrocities special coordinator within the IC. If the bill before you was signed into law, we would lose our seat at the table and our ability to shape court policies. The U.S. provides support for many ongoing investigations: Darfur, Ukraine, Cote d'Ivoire, Myanmar, the DRC, and elsewhere. All of these would be jeopardized if the U.S. sanctioned the ICC. American leadership is at its best when we're able to distinguish ourselves from our adversaries like Russia. Last year, Russia placed several ICC officials on a wanted list after the court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. If we sanction the ICC now, what is to prevent Russia from using our own actions to justify theirs? And sanctioning officials for doing their duty, are we comfortable embracing the same foreign policy that Putin does? This is not, nor should it be, a race to the bottom. The U.S. helped to build the system that has brought us unparalleled prosperity since World War II. This period included laying the groundwork for the establishment of an independent international criminal tribunal like the ICC. Though we may not be a member of the court or a party to the Rome Statute, 124 other countries are. In fact, the ICC's largest funders are amongst our closest allies: the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, France, and Japan. This bill puts us at serious risk of being forced to sanction many of our closest allies and partners, including 30 out of 31 NATO allies, 6 out of 9 major non-NATO allies who have obligations to the court, like Argentina, Australia, Japan, Jordan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea. This bill would put us on the untenable position of sanctioning our allies and partners. It would ensnare Dutch companies and nationals where the ICC is based, as well as nationals of other U.S. allies and partner countries who serve the court in a supportive capacity. But now we get to perhaps the most disturbing element of this bill, that it applies to the family members, including children, of designated individuals. Do we really want to be a country that targets people's families and children? If we do this, are we protecting American might, or are we projecting American spite? This is not who we are, nor who we want to be. This draconian approach is not necessary. There are other ways of addressing this issue: diplomacy, resolutions on a sense of Congress, encouraging and supporting Israel and challenging the court's jurisdiction, among many others. Everyone in this room understands that we are in an era of great power competition. The outcome of this competition will shape the world our children and grandchildren inherit. Only if we win will we be able to project a world that is led by our values and our ideals. This bill threatens that future, and I urge the committee to reject it. I yield back.
Chair, thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Representative Self, let me just ask you, as a practical matter, if what Mr. Representative Crow just suggested is correct, what is the harm if this bill does not pass?
The harm if this bill does not pass is the globalist agenda will win. He wants us to lead. Let's lead. Let's change the behavior of our allies. They want to lead. They use the word lead, but then they say, let's surrender. We need to make sure that the people who are not signatories of this organization are not targeted by it. And we can say that he didn't want to argue the details, but I will tell you the precedent that we set, precedent is powerful. And he also said that something about moral equivalence with Russia. It doesn't exist today. But this administration wants it to exist. And they're doing everything in their power to make sure that it becomes about. That's what we do not want.
Listen, I want to thank both of you for being here today. We've obviously had a long day already. We're probably going to have a longer day still. I appreciate your testimony. I'm going to yield to the ranking member of the Rules Committee, Mr. McGovern, for any comments he wishes to make.
Yeah, I think this is, I think it's a poorly crafted bill to begin with. And I think this is, I agree with Mr. Crow, this is exactly the wrong way to proceed. But let me ask either of you, I mean, what did the witnesses say during the hearing on this bill? Did we hear from both sides on, was there a hearing on this bill or a markup or?
I'm not on that committee.
You're not on the committee, but you're testifying on the bill?
From my experience on active duty, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well,
No,
so no, you can't tell me whether or not there was a hearing on this bill?
Yeah, I
or whether-
can
yeah,
tell
this-
you,
this-
yeah, there was no hearing on this bill. This has been pushed through without proper process, without a proper full engagement, and I think the results reflect that. It is half-baked in a very dangerous effort.
I mean, I don't know whether my Republican friends no longer believe in the committee process, but I mean, we have committees that are supposed to do hearings where people can bring witnesses and you can hear from all sides, and then if there's problems with the bill, you can make amendments and you can mark it up, and then we can, address some of the issues that way, and there was no process at all. Am I correct on that?
Yeah,
This
you are
is the-
correct.
This is the first time that it's going to be talked about in a hearing setting before the Rules Committee. And I assume, Mrs. Sullivan, you don't believe in the ICC at all?
what I'm asking is that we make sure the ICC stays in its proper role as defined by the member nations. And I will tell you,
So do you
back to
believe,
your
do you believe
previous
it's, do
question.
you believe, so are you against the ICC pursuing the case against
What I have
Hamas?
said is we need to make sure the ICC stays in its lane, which is defined by its member nations, and it says that you cannot go after a nation except if the events occur on its property. Palestine is not a nation.
So they should not go after Hamas, under your definition?
No, absolutely
Okay.
not. No,
I
the
disagree with you.
ICC.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I will tell you, Secretary Blinken has called, the ICC took a profoundly wrong-headed decision on these arrest warrants. I don't understand why,
Well,
I came in here expecting Democrats to support this
I
bill.
just fundamentally disagree with you. I think Hamas should be held accountable, and I think, the crimes that are happening in Gaza right now, those who are responsible should be held accountable too. This is about victims, not about, whether your ally is being questioned or whether your adversary is being questioned. This is about the victims in Israel, the victims on October 7th, and the victims in Gaza. Mr. Crow.
Yeah, Ranking Member, I think it's really important to say, you heard several folks mentioned that they don't believe in subjecting non-parties to jurisdiction of the court, and yet Mr. Self, Chairman Burgess, and almost every member of this committee has actually signed on to, that is correct, Mr. Massey is not, he's one of the few who has not, as a matter of fact, but almost everybody else here has signed on to bills and efforts that would promote the court's jurisdiction over non-parties, in this case, Russia. There's plenty of precedents by folks in this room supporting the jurisdiction of the ICC over a non-party in the case of Russia, Ukraine, and other instances.
Yeah.
And again, I say, Ranking Member,
Yeah.
Israel is different. It is a major non-NATO ally. Russia is not,
So,
and I leave it at that.
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. So is Pakistan and Qatar, by the way. But the bottom line is that, I'm saying, if somebody's watching this, I mean, I'm sure they're amazed at what appears to be this incredible hypocrisy and these double standards that my friends on the other side of the aisle seem to be endorsing. And I have to tell you, I mean, I think human rights ought to be a centerpiece of what this country is all about. And the idea that, you're bringing this resolution that is going to sanction, by the way, am I correct, too, there's a process that unfolds, right? I mean, so these arrest warrants that have been requested have not been issued, am I correct?
That's correct.
Right, there's another level here that has to be reached, and that requires investigations, and it requires additional.
Ranking member,
yeah.
we'll go quickly.
You what?
We're talking about a week. We're talking about 2 weeks. That's why this bill has been brought to the floor so quickly, because we're talking about these decisions will be made. This is not congressional investigations of a year. This is week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. This is very fast.
And where did you get that date from, that these will be decided on? Where did the ICC tell you that in 2 weeks they're going to have a decision, or 3 weeks?
As far as I know, it's common knowledge, because I've seen it several places.
No, these processes normally do not go that fast. They usually take a long time. In fact, there have been investigations involving issues in the West Bank and in Gaza for many years that are have not matured yet. And as you mentioned, Ranking Member, in this instance, what happens is the ICC does not have the authority to try or to conduct investigations in absentia. So the issuing of the arrest warrants is the next step in the investigative process.
But I think they've announced,
where is the common knowledge coming from? I don't know, can you point, rather than saying common knowledge, can you point to us a citation from the ICC that says that in 2 weeks or 3 weeks?
I believe there are statements from the ICC that they're going to
Can you
take to
produce
this
any of them for us?
three-member court.
Can you produce
will
any?
then actually, well, I can. I'll
Oh,
get back to
it
you,
would be,
Ranking Member.
and that's one of the reasons why a hearing might have been a good thing to do. Because rather than people just saying things and saying, oh, it's common knowledge, that maybe if you had a hearing, you could actually get answers to these questions, and I think we might maybe have different conclusions.
Seeing the media is controlled by the other side, I think common knowledge would be something
All right,
we
well,
would
I think now
probably
we're going
hang our hat
down,
on.
we're going down a conspiracy, foxhole here that doesn't, I mean, whatever. You know what? The bottom line is, this is a lousy way to legislate, and quite frankly, it's shameful that we are here dealing with this. This is a serious matter, and we should be focused on how do you end the violence, and how do you protect the victims, and how do you prevent from being further victims. And it seems that that's not what you're concerned about, and I'm not interested in, quite frankly, conspiracy theories and all that other stuff. With that, I would yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky for questions.
I thank the chairman. This is an interesting bill for me. I've spent 12 years here trying to be consistent on this stuff, on sanctions, on international organizations that may be outside of our Constitution. And so I wasn't sure how I was going to vote on this bill. I don't vote on titles. And I kind of know I think I know the reason it's being brought up recently. But I've read the bill, and I've noticed some interesting things about it. So when I asked you, Mr. Self, about this, isn't it true that the bill does not mention Israel, Netanyahu, Gaza, or Hamas, or any specific country or person? It's just
It does not.
It does not even in a whereas clause, which I appreciate. Usually, a lot of times, the whereas clauses are the reason I vote against a bill, because it's whereas something that's not true, and now we're going to resolve this. But I didn't see, there's no whereas clause here, so I appreciate that. It doesn't target any specific country. Now, it does have categories of countries, like NATO allies or strong non-NATO members, strong allies, et cetera. The reason I scanned the bill to make sure it didn't have anything like that in there is I don't want to condone what Israel's doing. I don't want to condone the way Netanyahu is waging the campaign against Hamas. because I think there are too many civilian casualties. 1% of the civilian population of Gaza is no longer breathing air, no longer on this planet. And we've just somehow accepted that level of civilian casualties, whether it's 2 civilians for every enemy combatant, is okay, which I do not accept. So I just wanted to make sure when I read this bill, even though I know the urgency for it, the reason it's coming up this week, obviously you've mentioned the context for that, is the common knowledge that ICC is going to target people that aren't within its jurisdiction. But I want to be clear, and this may be the only chance I get to speak on this bill, I do not condone the way Netanyahu or any of the generals in Israel are conducting this war. But I do support this bill because none of that's in there. Israel's not in there, Netanyahu's not in there, Gaza, Hamas, none of that is in there. It's written generally, which I think most bills should apply not just to specific actors, but in whole, you should say what you mean to do, and I think this bill does, which is, and I think it's a strong statement that we are not in the jurisdiction of the ICC, and a lot of our allies aren't either. It does have sanctions in it. Now, I've never voted to sanction another country. I've been here 12 years. I've never voted to sanction another country. But this bill doesn't sanction countries. It sanctions an institution which I don't believe we're under the jurisdiction of. It's a global institution that has members who aren't member countries, who aren't democratic, and we are not in the jurisdiction of this institution. So I think pushing back on it is a wise thing to do, not because of the special circumstance right now, but because we would never let President Biden be subjected to this court. We would never let President Obama, I mean, there were people who wanted him, not too many in this country, but there were people outside of this country who thought Obama was a war criminal for the drone strikes that were conducted on wedding parties. There are people who thought that George Bush was a war criminal. And we would never submit one of our leaders, and I notice this bill also covers members of Congress, we would also never submit one of this body to a global institution which we don't recognize as having jurisdiction over us. And even if this body voted to give this global institution jurisdiction over Americans, I would vote hell no on that. So,
The gentleman.
yeah, I'll yield to the gentleman
One
from
second.
Texas.
I just want to clarify for the record, because I just want to make sure we're accurate here. I certainly, statement against interest, I would certainly want your support of the bill. The legal language does not mention Israel. The findings do have some references to Israel and the Prime Minister. I just want to make sure that's clear for the record.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are those in a whereas clause, or?
They're in findings at the first place.
Okay.
First page. It might have been an older draft or whatever, but there are a couple findings, and the gentleman can look.
Well, maybe I'll vote against it.
Well, you might. I want the
there are
record to
6
reflect the reality.
If I may.
Yes, please.
There are 6 references to Israel, 1 reference to Benjamin Netanyahu, 1 reference to Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant, and it does go into detail strongly condemning the investigations against those individuals in Israel.
So I may have been operating off an earlier draft, or just, but this still stands after the resolve clause. What's in the resolved portion of this is that once you get past the findings, it still stands that we're talking about all of our allies, and ourselves included, are not subject to the jurisdiction of this. Now, to Mr. Crow's point, I do hope that anybody that takes a certain position today will take that position later when we start trying to say that other people are war criminals and that they should be subjected to the ICC. I am concerned that there may be a double standard here on both sides of the aisle. Yes, Mr. Crow.
Yeah, again, if I may, and I do appreciate your consistency on this issue, Mr. Massey, and even though I disagree with it, but you have been consistent, I will admit that. I think there's a really fundamental difference between having concerns over jurisdiction, which I do, actually. I have some jurisdictional concerns with the ICC in this case, the case that's under consideration in this bill, because it implies that there is a state of Palestine, and while I support a two-state solution and a pathway to achieve that, we are not yet there. So there's a jurisdictional element there. And also, you know, like I said in my opening statement, a long-time supporter of making sure we're defending our troops and not subjecting us unnecessarily to the jurisdiction of the ICC. So there's a difference between having concerns about jurisdiction, which I share, versus affirmatively reaching out and sanctioning this body. This body, which includes 30 of our NATO allies. Only the United States and Turkey are the only NATO countries that are not parties to and don't have legal obligations to the ICC. And then 6 other major non-NATO allies as well. So significant treaty obligations.
Are we in that list of people that aren't, you said there's 2 NATO allies?
Right.
As
So
well as us?
Of all of NATO, it's only the United States and
Okay.
Turkey who are not a party to the ICC.
And I hope we never are. Like I said, I would never want to subject a member of this body or a member of the executive branch of this country. As I think Mr. Self said, if we're going to lead, we should lead. And we should have good relations with every country. And we should conduct ourselves in a manner that sends a signal to the rest of the world that we're not tyrants. And when confronted with that, we'll go against it. But Mr. Self, did you have something to say?
I would. I'd like to address a couple of your points, Mr. Massey. The urban warfare is the most dangerous warfare for civilians. The casualties in Gaza have not been out of line with historic norms at all. In fact, they've been pretty good in terms of percentages. The problem I have with that statement is that the Biden administration just recently withheld a package of weapons systems. Now, they focused on the 2,000-pound bombs because that sounds big, and believe you me, they are. But there were 2,000-pound bombs or 500-pound bombs in there, but the one I want to focus on is the precision guidance add-ons that were also in that package, that they were going to strap on those bombs to make a dumb bomb a precision-guided weapon. So they held that up.
I want to give you as much time as you want, but that was a week before last bill. I mean, I mean, we were talking about withholding that, and you and I did vote differently on that bill, I think. But this week's bill, by the way, I did have the copy from 3 days ago and not tonight's copy. I wanted to get the record. Thank you.
Where do you get an actual copy?
So anyways, and that's my summary of this. I don't need to go on very long. I don't condone what Israel's doing. I think, you know, you said these are acceptable ratios of civilian casualties to...
I didn't say acceptable. I said historic norms.
Historic norms. Well, if 1% of the U.S. civilian population were eliminated, that'd be 3.5 million people. That would be 1,000 9/11s. So I don't accept these numbers, even though historically they may. I mean, there have been a lot of atrocities over historically. You know, and I don't think we should be a party to that. And I think that what's going on right now in Gaza is too many civilians are dying. I understand that there's tit for tat, and you know, if Hamas strikes Israel, Israel's going to strike back. But there are way too many innocent civilians dying. So now that I have the most recent copy of the bill, and there are findings in the newest copy, I need to see if I'm still going to vote for it.
If I may?
Yes, Mr.
Massey?
Crow.
Yeah, and first of all, to Mr. Self's point, I am personally and intimately familiar with the rigors of urban combat. I, in fact, fought as a paratrooper in the Battle of Asamoah in 2003 during the invasion of Iraq, and the Battle of Asamoah was the largest, most sustained urban combat that the 82nd Airborne Division was involved in since World War II. But I also have taken it upon myself to dive really deep into the details of this particular conflict from a policy perspective. And our government and other organizations have done very detailed analysis of the last 10 major urban conflicts, of which this is by far the worst. So I'd be happy to set up a briefing or more information to Mr. Self and others that show that this particular conflict in Gaza is significantly higher in terms of civilian deaths than the other comparable conflicts that we've seen in modern history.
Well, I appreciate your service in urban combat. I think it's, you know, we probably had the munitions to level Iraq, but I mean, part of the reason when you engage in war with soldiers that you don't just level the civilian population is that when the whole thing is over, you're trying to engender their trust and set up some kind of sustainable society, and hopefully a society that doesn't hate your guts. And when you go in and indiscriminately, you know, you can wage war with soldiers door to door, or you can do it with bombs. Regardless of how precise they are, these things have a radius of hundreds of feet, that they're a kill radius, lethal radius. Not everybody is guaranteed to be killed in that radius, but a lot of people are going to die in that radius. So even if we can deliver them within 5 feet in a city, you still have a radius of where you're going to decimate everything within 100 feet of that, and could kill people up to 600 feet away with the 2,000-pound bomb. So I think it's an unfortunate situation that we're in, and I'll just close. I know I promised to close before, but then I yielded time to Chip Roy. My perspective changed. He usually does that. I'll just close by saying I don't condone what Israel's doing right now, but I do think that we and our allies are outside of the jurisdiction of this international global institution. And so I'm inclined to vote for the bill, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The lady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you. I think part of the exchange that we just heard between Mr. Massey and Mr. Roy shows the need for a markup here. There's multiple versions of this bill circulating, and nobody's entirely sure what's in it because the language has been changed, the predicates have been changed. Something this serious deserves more serious consideration than it's received thus far. You know, since October 7th, we've seen a variety of foreign and domestic actors trying to exploit the war in Gaza for political gain. Here in Congress, as Mr. Massey pointed out in a recent debate, House Republicans have brought bill after bill after bill to the floor simply to play politics here in D.C. Now we've got the actions of the International Criminal Court posing a really serious and complicated diplomatic dilemma. And this bill totally fails to meet the seriousness and the complexity of this moment. It's totally fails to meet it. It's poorly drafted. It's not going to do anything to bring an end to the conflict, but it will damage our relationships with our allies. It will damage our status in the world stage. And it apparently can provide some cover for Putin, among others. So for all those reasons, it does not appear to be a good use of our time. I think it's seriously misguided. Representative Crow, you talked about the fact that this bill would sanction 30 of our NATO allies as well as other allies and impose sanctions on people completely unrelated to the court. Is that right?
It has an indirect effect on those. So the bill itself sanctions the ICC leadership and those directly or indirectly providing support to the ICC, which, you know, the 30 NATO allies who are a party to the Rome Treaty, as well as our 6 non-NATO major allies as well, would be implicated in this sanctions as it's broadly drawn in this bill.
Okay. Anything else you want to add?
I think it, you know, as I said in my opening, I think the precedent of being in the situation of having to sanction our allies or military personnel or government officials of our allies is a very dangerous precedent that should not be set.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina. Gentleman has no questions. The gentlelady from New Mexico.
Thank you so very much, and thank you, Representative Massey, for raising some of those issues that you did in your questioning, because I do think that we need to be careful that we don't start talking about it's reasonable to have this many people die, right? They are civilian deaths, they are deaths of children, they are deaths that are not warranted, and not a single one of them deserves to die. And I think that that's an important thing that you're raising. Mr. Crow, I was not able to be here, but I took note of some of your comments, and I think the importance of making sure that we do not undermine the alliances we have across the world is very important, and that the perspective you bring to it, which is very unique, of having been there and knowing what it means to have the support of your allies is something I value. So unless there's anything that you want to add.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. In addition to the reputational damage, which I think would be severe in the impact on our allies and our partners, there's actually the direct impact as well. I mean, we have numerous instances right now where we are providing information and support indirectly to ICC investigations, DRC, Burma, Cote d'Ivoire, Ukraine, because that's in our self-interest. We as a country have determined that it's in our self-interest to support victims, to support accountability in those areas, and to try to address conflict in those areas, because that's in our national security interest, all of which would be undermined and substantially jeopardized if this bill passes.
Thank you very much. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back to the gentleman from Texas. Recognized for questions.
I thank both gentlemen for being here and testifying. Just a few things. I know we're trying to move along in the interest of time. I would just, since we had the exchange with the gentleman from Kentucky, just stipulate for the record, I assume the gentleman from Texas, or from both gentlemen, agree in broad terms, the findings are laying out first that the United States and Israel are not parties to the Rome Statute or members of the ICC. And so therefore that raises legitimacy or jurisdiction over the United States or Israel. That's one primary, I think, an important point. Lays out the extent to which the prosecutor, Mr. Khan, announced arrest warrant applications for the Prime Minister, which I don't believe is disputed, and applications, to be clear, because some people get that wrong in the press, but for the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense, Mr. Gallant, and does say that those should be condemned. I think, which I certainly agree with respect to condemnation. I believe there's bipartisan agreement on that in broad terms. And then there's a couple of other things in here which people can see, and the ICC's actions against Israel are illegitimate and baseless, which, again, consistent with the point here about the ICC itself, which I would argue is consistent with what the gentleman from Kentucky was saying, but I'll let him judge that for himself. But just for clarifying, since we had a discussion about it, I wanted to make sure people understood why those findings existed. I would ask the gentleman, Mr. Crow, respectfully, I mean, having served, do you believe that the ICC should be able to go after an American serviceman?
I do not.
Good, on that we have agreement. Do you believe that the ICC should be able to go after one of our allies?
Depends on the allies and the circumstances. Every individual circumstance is different. I'm assuming you're talking about this instance of Israel. I do have concerns of jurisdictional issues, and those are concerns that I think are worth debating. So the question is not, in my view, the concerns about jurisdictional issues, which have multiple components, right? There's the component of whether or not you're a party, but then there's also the implication that the ICC has made here, the assumption that the ICC has made here that the West Bank and Gaza are basically a state actor, part of a Palestine, which of course is something that should be debated as well. So those are debates that are worth having. The issue is, what is the remedy? And the remedy should not be, in this instance, sanctions, because I think that the blowback and the risk to the United States of this approach are severe.
Appreciate that. I mean, I'd ask my colleague from Texas about the importance of sanctions here. I mean, I think we've had some discussion here about the precedent setting, and the gentleman from Texas discussed the precedent setting, and the extent to which we allow the ICC, which we do not, the jurisdictional question has been discussed here, which we're not a party to, that you have a court out there that could be turned on, and it's not without precedent, that they try to come after and target American service members. And when the ICC takes this kind of a step, which has been condemned pretty roundly by members of both sides of the aisle, executive branch and legislative, and this is now I'm going to assert my position on it, that is deserving of significant rebuke, and that without something with teeth, that you're not going to limit the extent to which the ICC feels empowered and permitted to engage in this sort of activity in the future, including directed towards our own service members or our own Americans engaged in this kind of activity. And so I would ask the gentleman from Texas if he agrees with that and underscores the importance of timing, that stopping this before it moves very far down the track is critically important because of the unbelievably egregious nature of the ICC announcing the intent to issue warrants against the Prime Minister of Israel. I mean, I just want to say that out loud, and the Defense Minister of Israel, and that merits the strongest possible rebuke by the United States, and therefore setting up a construct, which this is designed to do, not haphazardly, but in direct consultation and working, by the way, across the aisle. Not that we reached agreement on every point, as is evidenced here in the debate, but reaching the ability to use a model, in this case, CATSA. I mean, we took an existing framework that had been passed and passed on a bipartisan basis, applied that framework, and that is literally the basis of the construct for how the president could grant some waiver by coming to Congress and presenting it on a case-by-case basis. We tried to use that existing model. But I think at the end of the day, it's just a question of sanctions or no sanctions. I mean, we can debate some of the specifics. And like the gentleman raises points about the extent to which the language allows its extension to countries that are supporting the ICC, allies are supporting the ICC, and family members. The purpose of it was to, in fact, put teeth into it. It was to say that if you're a judge and you are targeting Americans, or you're targeting our friend, the Prime Minister of Israel, yeah, maybe you're a kid who wants to roll over here and go to Harvard. Maybe that kid shouldn't be able to do that. I think these were questions that I think we thought through and thought were important to address. I wonder if the gentleman from Texas would have thoughts on that matter, and then I'll allow the
It's vitally
Mr. Crow.
important we kill the snake while it's young in the nest.
Yeah.
That's the analogy. And that's, I believe we talked a lot about alliances here. I believe that our Western European allies, when they realized they could be next, they might join us. And frankly, there is a national security waiver in this bill, if I remember right, Mr. Roy. So we can actually have waivers for this bill should it be in the national interest of the United States. So absolutely, you are exactly right, because I've heard several comments here about undermining our alliances, damaging our reputation in the world. Folks, I don't know how much our reputation in the world can get any lower. There's an old saying about whales in the ocean, but we've got to do something to reestablish our reputation in the world. And I yield back.
I assume the gentleman both, and I'll let the gentleman respond. Mr. Crow, did you want to respond or?
Sure, I
give you time.
I vehemently disagree with this notion that our reputation worldwide is couldn't be lower. So what does it matter? I think our reputation matters a lot. I think our reputation is very strong. We certainly have issues like every country that we need to address. But as I said in my opening, this is not a race to the bottom, nor should it be. We work with the ICC all of the time when it's in our vital national interests, right? So if we're going to be about rules of law, if we're going to be about consistency, if we're going to be about supporting international institutions, then the thing about rule of law is you either support it all the time or you don't. You can't support it some of the time, or you can't only support it when you agree with it. And why I raised that last point is because, and I raised this also in my opening, you all supported the Ukraine War Crimes Deterrence and Accountability Act, right? Which supports the ICC investigations against Russia, when Russia is not a party. So, to stand here now and say, the jurisdictional issue is the predominant one doesn't really fit with the history there. Then the last thing I'll say is the facts of specific instances are really important, because one of the primary things to look at when you look at whether any tribunal is appropriate for a given instance is the issue of whether or not there is an internal domestic legal process that can actually handle the issue within a country, right? And that's one of the reasons why we've all supported prosecutions and actions against Russia, because of course there is no viable internal process there. So we have to look at every individual circumstance on its own merits.
Mr. Roy, if I could respond to the Ukraine comment. Did not Ukraine authorize action inside Ukraine?
Well, in my recollection of that bill is that it did not specifically mention the ICC. I understand the gentleman's point, but I think what's important here is the threshold question, and the gentleman responded to it honestly, and I appreciate that when posed with the question whether the ICC, if it went after our own service members, the gentleman said he would not support that, nor would I, nor do I think any of us should. And I think the question here is whether, when we have a close ally and you have the ICC and you're empowering the ICC, right? If you kind of sit back and allow the ICC to engage in that activity against a non-party state, our ally, engaged in defense, then what precedent does that set, right? What precedent does that set to have an international tribunal to which we're not a party, to which our allies are not a party, having a judge issue warrants against the prime minister of somebody that we're relying on to help defend us in the Middle East, in theater, engage in active conflict, dealing with the fact that they had their own individuals who were targeted and killed October 7th of the most horrific crimes possible, dealing with the constant affront of thousands of missiles being shot at them from Hamas. And we can debate, and I'll take the gentleman at his word about the relative ratio, rate of casualties and with respect to civilians in Gaza. I've certainly seen reports that would suggest that the numbers are actually fairly impressive in terms of what they've been trying to do to target and avoid hitting civilians while still trying to carry out the activity of taking out Hamas. And I think here the question is whether the United States of America stands alongside Israel in trying to stop Hamas from continuing to do what they're doing, which is targeting Israel, to eradicate Israel, undermine Israel, our ally, our stated ally. And that, I think, is what is right before us right now. And when we have the extent to which the ICC effectively broke its own rules under the Rome Statute of the ICC by permitting the recognition of the state of Palestine, when in fact it's only countries can be part of the ICC. Understanding the debate that's ongoing about that, these are the issues that I think are significant and at play. I would also note that former President Trump, when he engaged in, and not to politicize it in that way, but we're bringing up the issues that are important, that the sanctions against the ICC worked, right? And that the United States taking positions like that matter. And this is what it boils down to. Bottom line here is we have a significant number of our Democratic colleagues who recognize what the ICC did here was horrific and needs actual teeth in response. We hope and believe that those Democratic colleagues will join with us in saying the United States should speak with a consistent, loud voice and sanction the ICC for what they're doing to our ally Israel. And unfortunately, the White House seems unwilling to want to take that step for political reasons, whatever reasons we want to ascribe to the White House. And I'll only say that I had a significant, I'm not going to talk about private conversations, but I had a large number of conversations with Democrat colleagues across the leadership spectrum and rank and file, about this bill and this issue. And there's a lot of interest in wanting to work on it. A lot of it, and working on this construct, a construct that is not plucked out of thin air, isn't just made up, is modeled after existing statutes that we have agreed to. Literally take the statute right out of it and boom, put it in here and apply it. I think this is a simple question, and I think that's what's being laid bare here. Should we sanction the ICC or not? I think that is the question that is before us.
Mr. O'Connor, can I
Yeah,
comment on that?
John's time, but I know we
think
got
there's
votes.
a question. I think there's a question of the underlying concerns, of which there is broad bipartisan concern about certain elements of this case versus what's the appropriate remedy.
Fair.
And the White House did come out and release a statement of administration policy just a couple of hours ago,
Saw it.
where they said they're willing to work with Congress to figure out the appropriate remedy. So people are coming to the table and they're saying, all right, we have concerns, we have bipartisan concern about this, let's figure this out, but the remedy can't possibly be, we're going to put ourselves into a position of sanctioning 36 of our NATO and major non-NATO allies, sanctioning children of officials of the ICC, and also directly undermining all of the cooperation that is in our interests that the ICC is doing, that we are assisting in because it serves our national security interests. That couldn't possibly be the remedy, and that's my point. I think there's a lot of people who are willing to step up to the plate and say, you know what, let's take a step back. Let's go through the process. Let's have a hearing. Let's think about the secondary and the tertiary and the unintended consequences of this. Let's take a breath and figure out a path that doesn't jeopardize our own national security and our own interests in the manner in which this bill, because of the way it's drafted, does.
Mr. Self, do you want to speak to that? And
I
have one more
would just
thing,
say,
then I'll turn back.
Mr. Roy, I appreciate your leadership getting movement on this, because I think he's right. There's movement, and I appreciate this bill doing that. Thank you.
I appreciate it, gentleman from Texas. I would just note that since the ICC's founding, which has now been over 20 years ago, every United States administration, both sides of the aisle, both parties, have refused to join the court, recognizing the concerns with its politicization and misuse. We are seeing a direct misuse directly right in front of us. As this Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, said, quote, "We maintain our longstanding objection to the court's efforts to assert jurisdiction over personnel of non-state parties such as the United States and Israel." We're seeing them engage in it as we speak. It is incumbent upon Congress to act, particularly when the White House refuses to. With that, I yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Indiana for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. The Bipartisan American Service Members Protection Act was enacted in 2002 to protect U.S. military personnel, U.S. officials and military personnel of certain allied countries against criminal prosecution by an international criminal court to which the U.S. is not a party, stating, quote, "In addition to exposing members of the armed forces of the United States to the risk of international criminal prosecution, the Rome Statute creates the risk that the President and other senior elected and appointed officials of the United States government may be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court." In 2020, President Trump issued Executive Order 13928, sanctioning ICC officials, employees, and associates who engaged in any effort by the ICC to investigate, arrest, detain, and prosecute U.S. citizens or allies, including Israel, that are not part of the ICC or have not granted the ICC jurisdiction. Unfortunately, on April 2nd, 2021, President Biden revoked Executive Order 13928, allowing the ICC to target U.S. citizens and Israel. And just 3 years later, the prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, announced arrest warrant applications for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant, together with warrants for Hamas terrorists. So my question is for Mr. Crow. Mr. Crow, yes or no, does the ICC have the jurisdiction it's claiming over Israeli officials? Yes or no?
That's not a yes or no question. There are a lot of factors that we have to take into account, and I mentioned those earlier.
It's a very easy yes or no question. Do you believe
It's
the
not
ICC...
an easy yes or no question.
Do they
There's a
have
lot of
jurisdiction over
The issue
Israeli
of legal
officials?
jurisdiction is a very complicated, fact-specific question of which there needs to be debate and there needs to be a
Okay.
full hearing.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Because of the lack of clarity.
I'm just saying, that's why there should have been a hearing on this bill.
So I understand you've said many times, and you've kind of done backbends to talk about how that we should not be subject to the ICC in the United States, but yet we should stay engaged with them and not impose sanctions. And in fact, in April of 21, Secretary of State Blinken issued a statement maintaining long-standing objection to the court's efforts to assert jurisdiction over personnel of non-states parties such as the United States and Israel. However, he also added, our concerns about these cases would be better addressed through engagement with stakeholders in the ICC process rather than through the imposition of sanctions. But Mr. Crow, isn't engagement a signal that the ICC has some sort of authority over the United States that they don't have?
No, that's not true at all, nor have I done backbends. I've been extremely clear about this, that there are many examples in complicated foreign policy issues where we are not part of a treaty or not a part of a partnership, but we can still engage peripherally and support certain elements of treaties and partnerships. We do that all the time.
I would argue that by engaging, you are giving legitimacy to the ICC over the interests of the United States, when in fact the United States has never joined the ICC or the Rome Statute under a Republican or a Democrat administration. The Crow argument is that we're better off by staying engaged with an unaccountable international body, but this shows that notwithstanding increased U.S. engagement under recent Democrat administrations, our worst fears are coming true. The ICC is claiming jurisdiction over non-parties without any legal basis. To me, we should go back to President Trump's position. We have seen military recruitment at an all-time low under the Biden administration, and their current position on the ICC makes, I believe, it even less likely that young men and women would want to join our armed forces when the government of the United States is allowing legitimacy to the International Criminal Court, which could subject them to investigation and prosecution.
When the gentlelady
And with
yield
that,
time?
I yield back.
Can I have some time, Chairman?
Yes.
Yeah, just to correct the record, the American Service Members Protection Act is law. It remains alive and well, and it provides full protection to the U.S. service members, and nothing in this bill, whether it passes or not, would change that.
Thank you for the clarification. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's all been said. I would point out that Palestinian leaders joined the ICC in 2015. Is that correct? Palestine went in 2015.
That's what they say. I'm not sure that they joined.
Okay.
I think because they were not declared a state in 2015, and still have not been.
Okay.
But you're right about the date.
I mean, when you're trying to find news on this, you basically do a search and then you read on it. And it's, a lot of the discussions revolve around the argument that the Palestinian leaders thought that by joining the ICC, it would give them to get arrest warrants issued against Israel's leadership. Now, I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying if you go back and you simply read the articles that are out there, that's one of the primary reasons they joined it. So they don't have jurisdiction over the U.S. We have chosen not to join them. They don't have jurisdiction over Israel. Israel has chosen not to join them, and I understand why. And I won't belabor the point any further or ask any questions. I would just suggest to you that if you look at this issue, the Palestinian leaders joined April of 15, I believe it was, and there was a big part of their discussion was that it would put pressure on Israel from a political standpoint. Now, there was an argument against that, and that it was going to subject some of their homegrown people to some of the same potential arrest warrants. But I think it's disingenuous for anyone to equate what Israel has done to what Hamas, a terrorist organization, is doing. With that, I yield.
Chair, thanks, gentlemen. Gentleman yields back. Seeing no other members wishing to ask questions, this panel is excused, and thank you for your participation. Without objection, the committee stands in recess, subject to the call of the chair, returning at the beginning of the last vote.